I found the map on a rainy afternoon, tucked between the pages of a book I hadn't opened in years. The book itself was unremarkable, a faded journal, the kind you'd find in a second-hand shop, its leather cover cracked and brittle. But the map of the map was something else. It was folded unevenly, edges frayed, stained with what looked like old watermarks, maybe even coffee or tea. I remember thinking it smelled faintly of the forest, damp earth, and moss. It called to me in a way I didn't understand at first. I was alone in my apartment, the rain tapping gently against the window, a steady rhythm that made the world feel smaller and quieter. I unfolded the map on my desk, smoothing out the creases, and my eyes caught on a small, hand-drawn symbol, a tiny cabin, barely larger than a dot, set deep within a cluster of trees. The lines were rough, almost childlike, but the way the trees were drawn, they seemed to lean toward the cabin like they were protecting it, or maybe hiding it. Something about that little mark felt familiar. I traced the path from the nearest road, following a thin line that wound through hills, a river bend, and a clearing that the map labeled only as Hollow Creek. My fingers lingered on it longer than they should have. I couldn't place why, but a shiver ran down my spine. I felt like I had seen that path before, not on any real map, not in person, but in a dream, or maybe in a memory I hadn't yet remembered. The journal had belonged to a distant relative I barely knew, an uncle once removed who had disappeared years ago, the kind of story that families whisper about but never quite explain. The last entry I could find in his journal mentioned a cabin deep in the woods, a place he claimed held the answers to something important. But the entries were scattered, vague, and smudged by rain or tears. And now here I had the map. It seemed impossible, yet here it was, as if waiting for me to find it. I spent the afternoon examining it, running my fingers over the faint pencil markings, the slight indents from the pen, the smudges that suggested someone had handled it carefully, or nervously, before me. The thought made me uneasy. I closed my eyes for a moment, imagining the cabin, small, wooden, probably sagging in parts, hidden among the trees. I imagined walking up to the door, hearing the creak of the hinges before anyone or anything answered. I don't usually believe in signs. I don't usually let objects dictate my decisions. But that map, it lingered in my mind long after I set it aside. That night I found myself waking from dreams of dense forests I had never walked, paths that twisted and turned, rivers that cut through dark valleys. The dreams were vivid, unnervingly so. In one of them I stood at the edge of a clearing, staring at a cabin just like the one on the map. The windows were dark, yet it felt alive. There was something there, something waiting, and I couldn't tell if it was dangerous or simply lonely. The next morning I made a decision. I would find the cabin. I told myself it was curiosity and adventure, something to break the monotony of my days, but deep down I knew it was more than that. There was a pull, subtle but undeniable, drawing me toward that forest, toward Hollow Creek, toward the unknown. I packed lightly, a notebook, a flashlight, some water. The journal and the map went in my bag. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I didn't need them to understand. This was something I had to face alone. As I prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that the map had chosen me, or maybe it had always been meant for me. I remembered a line from one of the journal entries, smudged and hard to read. The forest remembers those who seek it. It will guide you or it will test you. I didn't understand what it meant at the time. I still don't, really. But the idea settled in my mind, quiet and persistent. The journey to the forest wasn't long in miles, but it felt long in anticipation. Each mile I drove, the world seemed quieter, as if the rain had washed away the usual noise. The cars, the distant voices, the hum of electricity. By the time I reached the edge of the forest, the sky was overcast, heavy with clouds that seemed to press down on the treetops. I parked my car near the trailhead, my heart beating steadily but not with fear. Not yet. The trail was narrow, overgrown in places, almost as if it had been abandoned for decades. My boots sank slightly into the wet soil, and I could hear the water dripping from the leaves, the occasional snap of a twig under my weight. Everything was alive with sound, yet there was a quiet hush that made it feel like the forest itself was listening. I kept the map open in my hand, checking the landmarks. Each bend of the path seemed familiar, yet alien. shadows stretched in ways that didn't match the trees. And I kept thinking about the cabin, waiting somewhere just out of sight. I stopped at a small clearing to rest, and that's when I noticed it. A faint impression in the dirt, like the outline of wheels or heavy boots. Fresh, old, I couldn't tell, but it reminded me again of the journal, of my uncle's words about the forest remembering. I felt a chill, but it wasn't fear. It was anticipation, that strange mix of dread and excitement that makes you want to step forward even when every instinct warns you to stop. I continued along the path, following the map closely. Every so often I would glance at the small cabin symbol, comparing it to the clusters of trees, the bends in the creek, the slight rise of the hill. The forest seemed to shift subtly around me, the trees leaning a little differently, shadows pooling in unexpected corners. I could feel it, a presence, not a person, not an animal, but the forest itself. It watched me, gauged me, waited. And I realized suddenly that the cabin wasn't just a place on a map. It was part of the forest, part of its memory. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes. My feet grew tired, my arms ached from carrying the bag and map, and yet I pressed on. I imagined what I would find at the cabin, empty, maybe decayed, perhaps hiding remnants of a life I would never know. Or maybe it would be alive in some way, as if it had been waiting for me all along. The thought was unsettling, but not in a way that made me want to turn back. It was inevitable. As dusk approached, I finally glimpsed it. Through a break in the trees, I saw the outline of a cabin, small and worn, its roof sagging slightly, windows dark and still. The air seemed to thicken as I approached, and a hush fell over the forest. No birds chirped. No wind stirred the leaves. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to take that first step onto its porch. And that was when I realized the map had led me here for a reason I couldn't yet understand. The forest had guided me, tested me, and finally it had brought me to the cabin. I stood there for a long moment, hesitant, aware of every sound, every shadow, every movement in the corner of my eye. I could feel the cabin's presence, patient, watching, quiet. I didn't know what I would find inside. I didn't know if I was ready to know, but the map had brought me here. And sometimes, in the quietest hours, when the rain drips and the wind whispers through the trees, I can still hear that subtle pull calling me forward. And I know somehow I will answer it. The deeper I walked into the forest, the more the world outside seemed to fade. The hum of distant traffic, the occasional bird call, even the rhythm of the rain that had guided me here hours ago, it all disappeared, replaced by a quiet so absolute it felt almost alive. My boots sank softly into the damp soil, each step muted by moss and fallen leaves, and I became aware of how alone I truly was. Not alone in the human sense. I knew I could turn back at any moment, but alone in the way that makes you conscious of every sound, every movement, every breath. The trail narrowed, branches brushing against my shoulders and hair, snagging on my backpack straps. It twisted and turned, sometimes opening into small clearings where the sky bled faint light through the canopy, sometimes folding back on itself so that the path seemed endless. I kept the map open in one hand, though I barely needed it. I could feel the direction in my bones, as if the forest itself were guiding me, nudging me forward, whispering in ways I couldn't hear. As I walked, I noticed subtle changes in the air. The temperature seemed to drop slightly, a cool dampness that settled into my skin. The smell of wet earth was stronger here, richer and somehow sweeter. There was a faint tang, metallic almost, but fleeting, and I couldn't tell if it was a smell or simply my imagination. The wind moved differently too, slower, more deliberate, and sometimes, in those moments when I stopped, I could hear something faint, like the rustle of leaves not moved by wind. Almost as if the forest itself were breathing. I thought of the journal again, of the vague warning my uncle had left behind. The forest remembers. It will watch you. At first, I had laughed at the words, imagining an old man's paranoia. But now, with the quiet pressing in around me, I understood. The forest did remember. Every step I took seemed to be recorded in the undergrowth, in the twisted roots, in the shadows that gathered just beyond my vision. It felt like it had been waiting for me, a patient observer, and that thought both comforted and unnerved me. Time seemed to stretch. Minutes felt like hours. I passed a fallen tree, its roots exposed like twisted fingers grasping at the soil, and something about it made me pause. I ran my hand lightly over the gnarled wood. There was an energy to it, almost imperceptible, a hum beneath the surface that made the hair on my arms rise. I shook off the feeling, telling myself it was just the quiet, just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. But even as I continued, I couldn't fully let go of it. At one point, I caught sight of a deer, though it wasn't a deer I recognized. Its coat was dark, almost black, and its eyes seemed too large, too reflective. It froze when it saw me, and for a long moment I felt as though it were studying me, weighing me, measuring something invisible. And then it vanished between the trees, soundless, leaving only the echo of its presence. I realized I hadn't heard a single snap of a twig, a single rustle of leaves as it moved. The silence returned, heavier than before, settling over me like a shroud. The path climbed gradually, a gentle rise that revealed glimpses of Hollow Creek through the trees. The water glinted faintly in the overcast light, but it felt different from a creek I had ever known. There was stillness to it, a dark patience. I imagined it carrying the memory of every person who had ever walked its banks, of every secret it had swallowed. And I realized that the forest and the creek were connected, bound together by memory and time, waiting for me to reach what lay beyond. I noticed signs of passage, subtle, almost imperceptible. A broken branch pressed down in the shape of a step, leaves disturbed in a pattern that didn't match my own path. At first I thought I was imagining it, but then I realized I was not alone in a way that didn't require another human being. Something had been here before me. Something had watched, waited, perhaps even guided me. My pulse quickened, though I forced myself to breathe slowly, deliberately, to keep calm. This was the part of the forest that separated the ordinary from the extraordinary, the part that measured patience and intent. The trees began to thin slightly and a small clearing appeared ahead. Light filtered through in irregular patches, casting elongated shadows that stretched like fingers across the ground. And then I saw it, the cabin. It was smaller than I had imagined, hidden behind a cluster of pines and maples. Its roof sagged slightly in the middle, shingles curling and darkened by years of rain. The windows were opaque with dirt and grime, and the door hung unevenly on its hinges. A thin trail of smoke, or perhaps mist, rose from the chimney, fatting quickly into the sky. I stopped at the edge of the clearing, feeling the forest press in behind me, and the cabin stretch out before me, silent but undeniably present. The silence here was different. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was an active hush, as if the forest, the creek, and the cabin were holding their breath, waiting to see what I would do next. I noticed small details. The way the grass around the cabin was flattened in some areas, the faint trail leading to a side entrance, the smell of damp wood and earth mixing with something faintly metallic. It all suggested that the place had been lived in recently, or at least tended to. And yet no sign of life moved in or around it. I took a step forward. The soil was soft under my feet and I could feel the roots of the trees gripping the earth like hands. The closer I got, the more aware I became of the stillness around me. The birds had stopped calling. Even the creek seemed muted, its surface unnaturally calm. It was as if the world itself had conspired to make this place unreachable, and yet I had arrived. And arriving brought its own kind of unease. I circled the cabin slowly, taking in every detail. The wood was gray and weathered, covered in moss in patches, but there were signs of care. Scraps of firewood stacked neatly to the side. A window cracked just enough to allow air to pass through. A faint impression in the dirt that suggested someone or something had walked here very recently. I ran my fingers along the doorframe, feeling the texture of the wood, the tiny splinters that pricked at my skin. There was history here, layers of it. And the thought of uncovering those layers made my stomach tight, with anticipation and dread. I leaned against a tree, taking a moment to breathe and collect myself. My mind wandered to my uncle's journal again, to his cryptic notes and faded sketches. Perhaps this was why he had disappeared. Perhaps he had found something here he wasn't ready to leave behind. And maybe now it was my turn. The forest had brought me to the cabin, but it would not let me leave unchanged. As dusk began to settle, I realized the forest's light had shifted. Shadows stretched longer and the air grew cooler. I could feel the weight of the evening pressing down, the way darkness gathers not just at night, but in the quiet moments before it fully arrives. I stepped closer to the cabin, hearing the faint creak of the wooden siding as if it sighed under its own age. The stillness pressed closer, wrapping around me, waiting, patient and deliberate. I didn't knock. I didn't call out. I merely stood there, letting my gaze take in every detail, letting my senses adjust to the silence, to the presence of the cabin, to the forest that watched. I knew that stepping inside, or even approaching further, would change me. Something about this place demanded attention, demanded acknowledgement, demanded something I couldn't yet name. And yet I felt compelled to move forward. The forest had led me here, through the wet paths, the unseen impressions, the quiet watchfulness of trees and creek alike. It had guided me to this cabin, to its small clearing, to its still, waiting presence. And now that I was here, I felt it, an almost imperceptible pulse in the air, a quiet hum beneath the forest floor, a reminder that I was not merely a visitor. I was part of the forest's memory, part of the story it had been holding for decades, waiting for someone to listen, to see, to acknowledge. I took a deep breath and stepped closer. I hesitated at the cabin door longer than I care to admit. My hand hovered over the rough wood, feeling the chill seep through my fingers, the uneven surface pressing against my palm. The forest behind me was silent, almost reverent, and I could feel that quiet weight in the air, as if it were holding its breath along with me. Then, finally, I pushed the door open. The hinges groaned softly, a drawn-out sound that echoed into the shadows inside. Light from the overcast sky filtered through the grime on the windows, painting the room in muted shades of gray and green. Dust hung in the air, drifting slowly with every tiny movement, disturbed by nothing but the door's creak and my own breathing. The cabin smelled of damp wood, earth, and something faintly sweet, almost like burned sugar or old honey, a scent I couldn't place but that made my stomach tighten with a quiet unease. I stepped inside, boots sinking slightly into the uneven floorboards. The cabin was small, roughly 10 by 12 feet, with a low ceiling and walls darkened by age. Everything was still, but it wasn't empty. Signs of recent presence were subtle, almost cautious, as if the cabin had been lived in quietly with care. My eyes fell on a small table near the corner. On it were 3 half-burned candles, their wax hardened in irregular shapes. The wicks had blackened tips, like little scars, and the faint scent of smoke lingered in the air, despite the fact that no fire was burning now. The table also held a notebook. Its cover was leather, soft and creased, and the pages inside were filled with tight, careful handwriting. I picked it up slowly, as if moving too quickly would disturb whatever had been left behind. Flipping through the pages, I saw words that made no immediate sense. A jumble of thoughts, names, dates, strange observations about the forest, the creek, the cabin itself. Some entries were detailed, others barely more than single words. Yet each one carried a weight, a quiet desperation. I felt as though I were peering into someone else's mind, someone who had trusted the cabin enough to leave fragments of themselves behind. One entry caught my eye. The handwriting was shakier here, the ink blotched by what I assumed were tears or rain. It read, "They are here. I hear them moving outside. They wait. They know I am awake." My pulse quickened, though I forced myself to breathe slowly, letting the words sink in without panic. Whoever had written this had felt observed, but there were no traces of anyone now. No footprints in the dirt around the cabin, no sign of another presence. Yet the words seemed to linger, as if the cabin itself remembered them, holding the tension in the air. I set the notebook down gently and looked around the rest of the room. There was a small stove in the corner, blackened from use but cold and silent now. A few cooking utensils lay nearby, clean but slightly worn. On a shelf above, a collection of jars contained various herbs, dried leaves, and what looked like old berries. Everything had been placed carefully, methodically, as if the cabin's inhabitant had lived here quietly, away from the world. tending to small routines that no one else would notice. I moved toward the fireplace, noticing the remnants of an old fire. Ashes had been swept aside, but small blackened fragments still clung to the edges. It made me wonder when the last fire had been lit and who had done it. The thought of someone here recently, yet nowhere to be found now, gnawed at me quietly. I felt as if I were intruding, yet the cabin allowed me in. It accepted me, but on its terms. I noticed footprints in the dust near the table. Not fresh, not from today, but not entirely old either. The kind that suggested careful movement, someone stepping lightly, trying not to disturb too much. I traced them with my eyes, following the path to a corner where a small chair sat facing the wall. The chair was empty, but the space around it felt charged with attention, as if someone had just been there, observing, waiting. A shiver ran down my spine. Not the cold, but a quiet awareness. The sense that the cabin itself was alive in memory, that it held onto presence long after people had left. I moved slowly, taking in every detail. On a shelf near the stove, a collection of photographs leaned against the wall. They were black and white, edges curled, faces faded by time and exposure. I couldn't recognize anyone, though some appeared familiar in a way I couldn't name. A man in a hat standing near a creek. A woman with her back to the camera looking toward a dense tree line. A child holding something in their hands, face shadowed. There was no date written on any of the photos, no hint of who these people were, but I could feel the weight of their presence. I picked up one of the photographs and held it against the light. The image seemed almost to move in the corner of my eye, though I knew it was impossible. Shadows shifted across the face of the child in the photo, faint, subtle, like a memory struggling to stay. I set it down quickly, feeling the air thicken around me. The cabin didn't feel hostile, it never had, but it was alive with echoes, and I was becoming part of them. I returned to the table, drawn once more to the notebook. The next entry was more detailed, describing the routines of the person who had stayed here. I wake before dawn. The forest is quiet, but I can hear it breathing. I light a candle, and sometimes it flickers when I speak. I think it answers me, but only in silence. I am careful not to anger it. I am careful not to wake it. Reading those words, I felt a strange kinship. I understood what it meant to move quietly in a space that seemed alive, to sense the weight of unseen eyes, to feel the tension between being present and being observed. There were other signs too, footprints in the dirt outside that could not be explained, small disturbances in the dust on the floorboards, a faint indentation in one of the chairs as if someone had been sitting there recently. It was almost imperceptible, and yet I noticed it. The cabin demanded attention to the subtle details, rewarding observation with a sense of closeness, a feeling that its stories, its memories, could be felt if one moved slowly enough. As I explored, I realized the air inside had changed. The smell of damp wood mingled with something else, something faintly metallic, like the scent of iron or rain on stone. It reminded me of the creek I had passed earlier, of the rich, earthy smell that had pressed against my senses as I walked. There was a continuity here between the inside and the outside, a connection that made the cabin feel less like a building and more like an extension of the forest itself. The candle wax, the notebook, the photographs, the faint disturbances in dust and dirt, they all suggested someone had been here, carefully, attentively, almost reverently. And yet no one was visible. I felt a quiet tension, a lingering presence that was neither threatening nor comforting. It was a reminder that spaces, like people, carry memory. And sometimes that memory does not fade when the living leave. I sat for a moment on the edge of the chair near the table, letting my senses adjust to the room. Every sound felt amplified, the creak of the floorboards under my weight, the faint whistle of wind through a crack in the window, the soft drip of condensation from the roof. And yet, the cabin did not intrude. It simply existed alongside me, quiet, patient, as though it were waiting to see if I belonged here. The final thing I noticed was the diary, smaller than the notebook, tucked beneath a stack of papers. Its pages were yellowed and edges curled, ink faded in places. Flipping through, I found entries that made my skin prickle. They were cryptic, fragmented, sometimes incomprehensible, but a pattern emerged. observations of light, of sound, of shadow, notes about the forest, the creek, and the way the cabin itself seemed to respond to presence. The author spoke of quiet whispers in the corners of the room, of faint movements that were never caught, and of a feeling that the cabin, the forest, and perhaps the creek all remembered. I put the diary back carefully, closing it as gently as I could. I felt a strange reverence, a connection I could not explain. The cabin had been lived in, yes, but not just by a single person. It had been inhabited by memory, by careful observation, by presence lingering long after departure. And I understood then that I was not alone, not in the way I had thought. I had entered a space that carried the weight of countless quiet hours, countless unseen watchers, and countless small acts of living that had been preserved like delicate whispers. I took a deep breath, letting the stillness settle around me, feeling both calm and alert. The forest outside continued to watch through the windows, patient and silent. The cabin waited, and I realized that whatever had been here before, whatever presence lingered, would continue to exist long after I left. And somehow, I was part of that continuity now. I rose slowly, letting my eyes linger on the table, the notebook, the candles, the diary. Every object, every mark, every shadow felt charged with quiet life. I felt a subtle kinship with the person who had lived here, and a deeper awareness of the cabin itself as a living memory. I stepped back toward the door, not rushing, aware that leaving this place would not erase the feeling of being observed, of being part of something that extended beyond myself. I sat in the corner of the cabin, notebook and diary open in front of me, the half-burned candles casting long, trembling shadows across the walls. The light was weak, diffuse, but enough to read by, and it made the dust in the air shimmer like tiny motes caught in some invisible current. I tried to focus on the words, the handwriting of someone who had lived here, who had left their thoughts scattered across the pages like breadcrumbs. At first, the entries were ordinary. Notes about the forest, about the creek, about the weather and the movement of light through the trees. But slowly, a pattern emerged. The diary spoke of moments of presence, of being watched, of hearing things that should not exist. And as I read, I became aware of a sound, faint at first, so faint I could have imagined it. A whisper, a hiss carried on the wind through the cracks of the cabin, through the half-open windows. It was subtle, almost polite, as if someone were merely trying to draw my attention without startling me. I paused, holding my breath. The whispering didn't repeat words clearly. It was fractured, half-heard phrases, fragments of sentences, almost like a memory echoing from another time. And yet it had a shape, a rhythm that tugged at the edges of my mind. I felt a strange familiarity. I couldn't place it at first, but it felt like a sound I had known before, like a memory I had not remembered consciously, a presence from the past brushing against me through the forest and the cabin alike. I returned to the diary. One of the entries was dated decades ago, though the ink had faded to a pale brown. The words were simple, but they carried a weight. I hear them at night moving through the trees. They whisper my name. I cannot leave. The forest remembers and the creek remembers. The cabin remembers. I'm not alone. I shivered, though I tried to breathe evenly. I understood that feeling now, the awareness of being observed, of memory pressing through space and time, of the past coexisting with the present in ways you cannot control. As I read, I began to notice more of the whispers. Not loud, not threatening, just there. Sometimes a soft syllable, almost like a sigh, a rustle that carried the faintest hint of words. I couldn't make them out clearly. I strained to listen, and the harder I listened, the more insistent they became. The forest outside was alive with memory. Every tree, every fallen leaf, every winding root seemed to hold a fragment of someone else's life, some tragedy that had unfolded here long ago. A page in the diary described a family who had lived here decades ago. Names were given sparingly, details scattered. A father, a mother, a child. The entries hinted at isolation, at sickness, at a tragedy that had occurred quietly and without witnesses. The words were vague but haunting. They were here. Then they were gone. The creek carried them. The forest took them. I saw nothing, but I remember everything. I felt a chill, and the whispering grew slightly louder, almost in response. as though the cabin approved of the recognition, the acknowledgement of its memory. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the diary rest in my lap. I could feel the cabin around me, its weight pressing gently against my senses. The whispers seemed to gather in corners at the edge of perception, faint reminders of all the lives that had passed through this space. I imagined the family, moving quietly through the cabin, their presence absorbed into the walls, the floor, the very air. It was not frightening. Not exactly. It was heavy with the weight of remembrance, a slow, inexorable awareness that this place was more than just wood and stone. The diary continued. A later entry described a traveler much like myself who had found the cabin unexpectedly. The handwriting was shaky, uneven. They came here looking for answers. The forest allowed them in, but the cabin watches, it waits. The walls remember. Every step, every thought, every quiet heartbeat becomes part of it. I hope they understand what they touch. Reading this, I felt an odd kinship, a disquieting reassurance. Someone else had walked these boards, felt the same pull, heard the same whispers, and yet survived. Or at least their memory remained. I opened the diary to another page. The words were fragmented, almost like dreams written down upon waking. Footsteps behind the door, faint shadows across the floor. The creek sings in my ears. I dream the trees move closer. The cabin sighs. I sit still. I do not breathe too loudly. I wait. I listen. I remember. As I read, I realized the author had been describing exactly what I felt. The tension between presence and absence. The whispering memory of things that no longer existed, but had not entirely disappeared. The more I read, the more I became aware of the interplay between inside and outside. The cabin held memory, yes, but so did the forest. The creek carried the past along its waters. The wind rustled through the leaves, carrying fragments of voices faintly, almost impossibly. I could feel the history around me pressing in, not with menace, but with insistence. It demanded to be acknowledged, to be noticed, to be remembered. At one point, I set the diary aside and listened. The whispers were clearer now, though still broken, fractured, teasing the edges of my understanding. There were words I almost caught, names, places, events, but they dissolved if I tried to focus on them. They were a suggestion rather than a statement, a half-memory rather than a reality. And yet in that suggestion, I felt the weight of decades, the quiet tragedies of people long gone but not forgotten, their lives absorbed into the forest, the creek, the cabin. I moved closer to the window, peering into the dim forest. The shapes of the trees swayed gently in the breeze, or maybe it was only my imagination. Shadows shifted in patterns that felt deliberate. I felt the pull of the outside world, the creek that ran unseen just beyond the tree line, carrying memory and silence alike. And I realized that the cabin was a vessel, a container for lives and experiences, a quiet archive of people who had loved, lost, suffered, and disappeared. The diary's final entry that night was the most unsettling. I leave something behind each day, small marks, little traces, so that the forest remembers me, so that the cabin does not forget. I'm a whisper among whispers. I hope someone hears. I hope they know what they find here is not empty. I put the diary down slowly. My fingers lingered on the cover, feeling the texture, the faint impressions of words pressed into the leather. I understood completely. The cabin was not empty. It had never been empty, and I was now part of its memory, whether I wanted to be or not. I sat there for a long while, the whispers filling the corners of my perception. They were faint, soft, almost comforting in their insistence. Not threatening, just present, just there, waiting, reminding me that places, like people, never truly forget. That tragedy, observation, attention, they linger quietly until someone acknowledges them. And I had. When I finally looked up, the forest outside was darkening with the approach of evening. The air carried the damp scent of soil, leaves, and the creek, but also something else, something I couldn't identify. It wasn't unpleasant, just heavy. It reminded me that the cabin, the forest, and the creek were intertwined, that my presence here mattered, even if only in small, imperceptible ways. I closed the notebook and diary, stacking them neatly on the table. The candlelight flickered across the walls, casting long shadows that merged with those of the forest outside. I could feel the weight of the past pressing gently, not in a frightening way, but with an insistence that was almost human. And I knew then that I would remember this place long after I left, that it would follow me in quiet ways, in dreams, in whispers carried on the wind, in memories I could not yet name. And somewhere deep in the forest, I imagined the creek flowing silently, carrying fragments of all the lives that had touched this cabin, preserving them in its water, in its memory, in its quiet insistence that nothing is ever truly lost. Night fell quickly in the forest. The remaining light bled from the sky in muted shades of gray and violet, leaving the trees dark and indistinct. Inside the cabin, shadows deepened along the walls, stretching across the floor in long, uneven shapes. The candle flames flickered, throwing their small circles of light across surfaces, yet nothing could fully illuminate the corners. And it was in those corners that I felt them, the shadows that did not stay still, that seemed to shift ever so slightly, as if breathing, waiting, observing. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination, that I had been staring at the same walls for hours, that my mind had grown accustomed to the isolation and the whispers that still carried from the forest outside. But every time my eyes moved, the shadows seemed to move with me, curling around the edges of the room, gathering and dispersing in a way that no ordinary light could cause. I felt a quiet tension, like the air itself had grown aware of me, waiting for me to notice what had always been there. I lit another candle, hoping to push back the darkness, but it only seemed to emphasize the shapes. The corners grew deeper in contrast, almost tangible. I could sense the weight of them pressing against the air like something alive crouched just beyond sight. And yet, when I looked directly, there was nothing but darkness. I felt a pull, a subtle insistence that told me the cabin remembered. That it remembered the lives, the movements, the fear and hope and small moments of those who had passed through before me. I returned to the window, peering into the forest and the creek. Its waters gleamed faintly in the moonlight, but there was no sound of rushing water. Even the air seemed heavy and still. Yet I could feel it, the pulse of memory, the soft echo of footsteps, faint murmurs carried along the water, fragments of long-forgotten voices. They were not threatening, but insistent, like reminders that nothing truly disappears, that absence does not mean emptiness. The forest had not forgotten, and now neither had I. I walked slowly through the cabin, my fingers brushing against the walls, the table, the shelves, as if to reassure myself that I was touching something real. But the shadows moved differently than the objects. They had a life of their own, curling along the edges of furniture, slithering along floorboards, stretching toward me when I lingered too long. And I could feel in the quietest moments the sense of being watched, not by a person, not by an animal, but by the space itself, by the weight of memory pressed into wood and stone. I opened the diary again, hoping to anchor myself in words, to read something tangible while the shadows writhed quietly. The entries seemed to resonate differently at night. The earlier observations about the forest, the creek, the cabin, they felt alive now. Sentences about footsteps that were never heard, about whispers in corners, about movements that existed only in memory, seemed to take on a new dimension. I realized I was not alone in thinking the cabin watched. Others had felt it, had acknowledged it, and had left traces of their awareness behind. In words, in candles, in small deliberate marks on the floor and walls. As I read, I heard it again, the faint whisper from the forest. A syllable, a sigh, almost imperceptible. My breath caught, but I did not panic. Instead, I leaned closer to the window, straining to listen. The forest pressed close. The creek hummed faintly beneath the earth, and the whispers carried fragments of thought. A name, a date, a fear, a hope. It was the residue of people who had once walked here, who had lived and left again. I realized I was hearing memory itself, preserved in space, carried through shadow and water, waiting for acknowledgement. I tried to rest in the cabin that night, settling onto the old cot in the corner. The mattress sagged slightly, worn from years of use, and the blanket smelled faintly of wood smoke and earth. I closed my eyes, telling myself that darkness was only a layer of air, that shadows were only the absence of light, and that whispers were only the echoes of the wind. But even as I forced calm, I could feel the corners of the room, the walls, the very air pressing close. They were patient, waiting. Not hostile, just insistent. I thought about my uncle again, about his journal, about his cryptic notes and vague references to the cabin and the forest. Perhaps he had known this, had felt the same presence that I now felt. Perhaps that was why he had disappeared, or perhaps he had left willingly, understanding the pull of the place, respecting its memory. I could feel a thread connecting me to him, to those who had come before, to the lives and tragedies and quiet observations that the cabin had absorbed. Sleep came in fragments, shallow and interrupted. I dreamed of the forest, of the creek, of the cabin itself. Shadows moved across my vision even as I closed my eyes, whispering fragments of memory I could not fully recall. I walked in my dreams among trees that bent toward me, leaves brushing against my skin, roots twisting underfoot. I saw glimpses of people, faces blurred, movements cautious, lives folded into the space I now occupy. And always I felt watched, acknowledged, remembered. When I woke, the first light of dawn was thin and gray, brushing faintly against the edges of the cabin. The shadows had receded, though traces remained in corners, along floorboards, and in the impressions left by objects untouched for decades. I rose, stretched, and looked around. The cabin was quiet now, almost ordinary, yet the weight of memory lingered. It had not released me entirely. It never would. I packed my bag carefully, making sure to leave the diary and notebook exactly as I had found them. The candles were placed back on the table, their half-burned stubs facing the same way. I wanted to leave respect, acknowledgement, a recognition of the lives and presences embedded in this space. I stepped toward the door, feeling the shadows in the corners stretch slightly, as if to bid me farewell. The forest outside seemed brighter in the morning light, yet it still held the weight of memory. Every tree, every root, every leaf seemed deliberate, as if the entire space knew I had been here and was now departing. I walked back along the narrow path to the car, listening for the faintest sound of movement. I could feel the shadows behind me, not pressing close, but present, patient, like a reminder that I was now part of the continuum of this place, that memory does not end with absence. Even as I drove away, the forest and the creek and the cabin stayed with me. At first it was subtle, a whisper at the edge of thought, a shadow in my peripheral vision. But as the hours passed, I became aware that the presence followed me, not in a threatening way, but as a quiet insistence. It reminded me that places carry memory, that space remembers, that lives once lived, leave traces that endure long after departure. At home, I unpacked slowly, setting down my bag and placing the map and journal carefully on my desk. The apartment felt ordinary, almost mundane, yet I could sense echoes of the forest pressing against the walls, shadows lingering in corners, whispers at the edge of perception. I was not alone in my own home, not entirely. And I realized that the cabin, the forest, and the creek had become part of me, woven into my awareness, a subtle, quiet presence that I would carry forever. The night that followed, I could still hear the whispers faintly, faint enough to make me question if I was dreaming or awake. They were like a gentle insistence. Remember, acknowledge, be aware. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the air shift, listening for fragments of memory carried through time and space. The cabin had released me physically, but its memory clung to me, quiet, patient, insistent. I was now part of its story, one more whisper among many. One more fragment woven into the forest and creek and cabin that would endure long after I had gone. And even now, in the quietest hours before sleep, I can feel it, the presence, the memory, the insistence. Shadows linger in the corners of my vision. Whispers carry in the spaces between sounds. And I know without doubt that the cabin and the forest and the creek are still there, patient, watching, remembering. I first saw the cabin while wandering along an overgrown trail in the forest. It was partially hidden by a tangle of vines and saplings, the roof sagging in the center, wooden shingles curling like brittle paper. At first, I thought it was a ruin left to rot, nothing more than a forgotten relic swallowed by the trees. But as I stepped closer, the stillness of the air, the way the sunlight fractured across the moss-covered walls made me pause. There was a sense about it, an almost magnetic pull that suggested it had been abandoned abruptly, but not without a trace of life left behind. The door was ajar, hanging unevenly on its rusted hinges. I nudged it gently, half expecting it to resist, half expecting it to creak loudly, announcing my intrusion. It gave way with a soft groan, and I stepped inside. The first thing that hit me was the smell: paint, old wood, and something earthy damp, almost like the soil itself had seeped in through the cracks. The room was small, low-ceilinged, but densely packed with objects that hinted at a life once lived, carefully preserved in silence. Canvases leaned against every wall. Some were stacked haphazardly, others carefully framed but faded with time. I walked slowly among them, trying not to disturb anything, running my fingers lightly along the edges of the frames. Each canvas held a forest scene, yet none of them looked like the forest I had walked through to reach the cabin. The trees were twisted, dark, and looming. The light in the paintings seemed to come from nowhere, casting unnatural shadows that shifted across the canvas as I moved. There were no animals, no birds, no human figures, just the forest, oppressive, silent, watching. I found myself drawn to a painting near the corner, smaller than the others. It depicted a path winding between two massive, gnarled trees. The perspective felt odd, skewed somehow, as if the path were longer than it appeared. I leaned closer, noticing details that made my skin tight. Faint footprints pressed into the painted dirt, and shadows that didn't match the trees. It was as if the scene itself had been aware of the artist, that the forest on canvas had a life of its own. The floorboards creaked softly under my feet, reminding me I was in a real space, but my eyes kept returning to the walls. Easels stood empty in some corners, their wooden supports warped and darkened with age. One still held a half-finished painting, brushstrokes bold and uneven, capturing a small clearing surrounded by dark silhouettes of trees. The clearing seemed almost alive, like it held a memory or a secret waiting to be noticed. I wondered if the painter had left in a hurry, abandoning the work mid-thought, or if he had simply disappeared into his own world, leaving the cabin and his paintings behind to age in silence. A smell of turpentine lingered faintly, though I could see no fresh paints. Only layers of dust settled over the surfaces, softening edges and muting colors, yet the atmosphere felt heavy with presence. The air was still, almost impossibly quiet. Even my own breathing sounded loud against the hush of the cabin. I realized then that this wasn't merely an abandoned space. It was preserved, curated by absence, marked by memory, and carrying something in its silence that made me both uneasy and unable to leave. Near the back wall, I found a small desk, cluttered with brushes, jars of dried pigments, and notebooks with cracked leather covers. I opened one carefully, feeling the spine stiff under my fingers. The pages were filled with sketches and notes, tiny studies of trees, patterns of leaves, angles of shadows. Some pages were torn or smudged as if the painter had been interrupted. Occasionally there were small annotations in the margins. Too bright, wrong angle, they will notice. The handwriting was tight and careful, but the words hinted at paranoia, or perhaps an acute sensitivity to the forest he tried to capture. As I examined another canvas, I noticed a recurring motif, a shadow at the edge of the forest, always on the periphery, never fully visible. At first, I thought it was merely artistic choice, but the more I looked, the more I felt a presence behind it, faint yet insistent. The shadow seemed to shift when I moved, always at the edge of vision. It was unnerving, but I could not turn away. I felt as if the cabin itself were holding its breath, as if it had been waiting for someone to see, someone to acknowledge the life that had once moved quietly through this space. I moved to the corner where several smaller easels stood. Each one displayed quick studies of the forest, gnarled branches reaching across fog-laden grounds, the creek winding silently among trees, empty paths that seemed to stretch endlessly. The paint was dark, almost viscous in places, giving the impression of moisture or shadow caught in motion. I realized I could almost hear the forest in these images, the soft sigh of wind through leaves, the distant trickle of water, the quiet rustle of unseen animals. It was the way memory works, I thought. The painter had trapped the essence of this forest, not the sight, not the light, but its subtle, living awareness. I sat down on a wooden stool, feeling it creak beneath my weight, and surveyed the room. The more I looked, the more I noticed small details that made the hairs on my arms rise. Fingerprints pressed faintly into dried paint, smudges along the edges of canvases, a single brush left standing upright in a jar as if frozen mid-use. The cabin was not just abandoned, it was paused, preserved in a moment between life and absence, with traces of someone who had poured themselves into it completely, yet left without explanation. I picked up a smaller notebook, flipping carefully through its pages. There were sketches here that did not match any of the paintings. Strange, jagged lines, distorted trees, forms that could have been human or animal or neither. Notes in the margins hinted at dreams or memories or obsessions I could not fully understand. They whisper in the branches. I cannot escape the watching. The creek remembers. Shadows follow, always follow. A chill ran through me. The words were not threatening, not overtly frightening, but they carried weight, a quiet dread that seeped into the corners of my mind. I set the notebook down slowly, breathing through the tension that had settled in my chest. The cabin seemed to exhale with me, as though acknowledging that I was noticing, that I was aware of what had been left behind. I realized that the painter had not merely captured the forest visually. He had captured its memory, its moods, its quiet insistence. Every shadow on the walls, every stroke on canvas, every whisper in the notes, all of it suggested that the forest was alive in his work, that the cabin had become a vessel for his obsession, his fears, and the lingering presence of the trees themselves. I lingered in the cabin long after the sun began to dip below the horizon. Shadows stretched across the walls, growing longer, merging with the corners where the easels stood. The forest outside had become a dark blur through the windows, and I could feel the quiet pressure of the night pressing inward. And yet, despite the unease, I felt compelled to stay, to observe, to witness the traces of life frozen here. The cabin demanded attention, and in that quiet insistence, it felt almost alive. Finally, I left the cabin, stepping back onto the moss-covered trail. The air outside was cool and heavy with the scent of wet earth, the forest whispering faintly among the trees. I glanced back once at the cabin, half hidden in the shadows. The windows seemed darker, deeper, as if watching, remembering me already. And though I walked away, the images of the canvases, the twisted trees, the shifting shadows, the subtle, watching presence, remained in my mind. Even now, thinking back on that day, I can see the cabin clearly in my mind's eye. The walls lined with forgotten easels, the subtle whisper of paint and memory, the sense of a life paused, preserved, waiting for someone to notice. It was not merely abandoned. It was holding something, keeping something, a trace of a painter who had poured himself into the forest and had left it to linger, quietly in the shadows, in the corners, in the stillness of the cabin. I returned to the cabin the next morning, drawn back by a curiosity I could not explain. The trail through the forest was faint but navigable, sunlight spilling in mottled patches through the dense canopy. Birds called in the distance, though their voices felt subdued, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. My boots pressed softly into the mossy ground, and with each step I felt a growing tension in my chest, a quiet anticipation, like walking into a space where memories lingered, where the past was folded into the present. Pushing open the cabin door again, I was struck by how little had changed. The air smelled faintly of paint and earth, the sunlight through the grimy windows illuminating the layers of dust that coated the furniture and canvases. I moved slowly, deliberately, as if hurrying would disturb something fragile, something preserved in time. Every detail demanded my attention: the placement of the easels, the angle of the frames, the subtle shifts in shadows across the walls. I approached the main easel at the center of the studio. The half-finished painting from yesterday seemed to change when I looked at it. The clearing in the forest appeared slightly different, as if the shadows had shifted, the branches had stretched just a little, and the light between the trees flickered as if it responded to my presence. I blinked and looked again. It seemed normal. Yet the sensation persisted, a quiet, insistent tug at the edge of my mind, like the forest in the painting was aware of me, like it was observing me in return. Each canvas around the room seemed to do the same. The twisted trees, the dark pathways, the shifting light, all subtly moved when I looked at them. Shadows lengthened, branches leaned closer, the empty spaces seemed to deepen. I could almost hear the faint rustle of leaves, though I knew it was impossible. And yet the effect was hypnotic, mesmerizing, unsettling. I felt both drawn in and cautious, as if the forest captured on these canvases had a consciousness of its own, responding to the presence of an observer in its territory. I walked slowly around the room, brushing a finger lightly along the edge of a frame. The paint felt rough, uneven, as if the artist had pressed it into the canvas with urgency, with emotion that had been abruptly paused. Each brushstroke seemed deliberate, almost alive, capturing not just the image of the forest but its weight, its silence, its pulse. It was unsettling to realize how much of the artist's attention had been focused on these details, how much of himself he had poured into each stroke, and how much the forest seemed to breathe through them. On a shelf nearby, I noticed a collection of small sketches, torn and smudged, depicting not just the trees but subtle forms hiding in the undergrowth. At first I thought they were animals, perhaps deer or foxes, but the shapes were too fluid, too ambiguous. I felt a chill as I realized they could be human, or neither. The forms seemed to shift when I tried to focus on them, as if the paper itself were alive, holding movement just beyond my perception. I could not tell if it was a trick of the light or the artist's intention, but it unsettled me in a way I could not dismiss. I picked up a notebook from the desk, its leather cover cracked and soft from age. Flipping through, I found notes describing the forest, the creek, and the way light fell across the cabin at different times of day. But there were also cryptic observations. The forest watches when I watch it. The shadows lean toward me. I cannot look away. I felt a sudden shiver, realizing that the painter had sensed the same awareness I now felt. He had documented it, expressed it in words and images, and left it here, waiting for someone to notice. The brushes on the desk were stiff with dried pigment. I picked one up carefully, examining its worn bristles. I imagined the painter using it, capturing the curves of a branch, the twist of a tree, the subtle play of light on leaves. Each stroke was a decision, a response to the forest, and now as I held the brush I could almost feel the urgency of that process, the need to capture something that was elusive, fleeting, yet insistent. The cabin seemed to hum with memory, the air thick with the presence of someone who had poured himself entirely into these walls. I returned to the main painting and studied it for a long while. The clearing seemed to shift again, subtly, and for a moment I thought I saw a figure standing among the trees, half hidden, watching. I blinked and it was gone. My heart thudded in my chest and I reminded myself to breathe slowly, to ground myself. It could be nothing, a trick of light and shadow, but the feeling lingered, pressing at the edge of my perception. I realized then that the forest in these paintings was not just a depiction. It was a presence, a memory, a quiet consciousness captured in oil and pigment. Near the back of the cabin, I found a smaller easel holding what appeared to be the artist's final work. The canvas was darker, almost entirely shadowed, with only hints of twisted branches and distant light peeking through. It was unfinished, raw, as if the artist had stopped abruptly, leaving the forest frozen mid-motion. I felt a pang of unease, imagining the thoughts that must have run through the painter's mind at the moment he abandoned it. I could sense his attention, his anxiety, the quiet tension of observing something alive and being observed in return. I spent hours moving through the cabin, examining each painting, each brushstroke, each sketch. The more I looked, the more I noticed subtle movements, subtle shifts that defied explanation. The forest in the paintings was not static, it responded to me. Shadows deepened when I approached, branches leaned toward me, and empty spaces seemed to stretch and contract as if breathing. I could feel the painter's hand in all of it, guiding me, warning me, inviting me to understand the life captured here. Eventually, I sat on the worn stool near the center of the room, letting my eyes wander over the canvases. I could hear the faint rustle of leaves outside, the soft drip of water from the roof, and I realized I was holding my breath, afraid that any sudden movement might disrupt the delicate balance of the cabin. I understood then that the painter had left more than images. He had left an experience, a subtle interaction between observer and observed, a meditation on the forest that persisted long after he had gone. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the presence settle around me. I could feel the weight of the artist's attention, the subtle consciousness of the forest in the oil, the quiet insistence of the shadows that lingered at the edges of my vision. It was unsettling, yes, but also hypnotic, drawing me deeper into the space, making me aware of my own presence in relation to what had been captured here. When I finally opened my eyes, I noticed the faintest shift in one of the smaller paintings near the window. A branch that had been angled slightly to the left now leaned right, casting a shadow that moved with an almost imperceptible rhythm. I felt a shiver of recognition, understanding that the forest, as seen through the painter's brush, was alive in memory and perception. I was no longer just an observer. I was participating in the dialogue between artist, forest, and observer, a quiet, intimate exchange spanning decades. I set the notebook down carefully, leaving the brushes in place, the easels as they were. The cabin felt heavier now, charged with the presence of memory and observation. I stepped back to the doorway, glancing one last time at the main painting. The clearing seemed to beckon, subtle, shifting, aware. And I realized I would not forget this, that the cabin and its forgotten easels had left a mark on me, a quiet insistence that lingered long after I had departed. Even outside, as the sunlight filtered through the forest, I could feel it, the echo of brushstrokes, the weight of observation, the presence of a life lived quietly and fully within these walls. It was not frightening exactly, but it was persistent, a gentle insistence that memory, attention, and subtle presence endure, and that the cabin, the paintings, and the forest would continue to move and breathe in the quietest corners of perception. The morning was overcast when I returned to the cabin, the sky a muted gray that seemed to seep through the forest like fog. I had thought I knew the space, thought I understood the subtle movements in the canvases and the quiet weight of the air, but something had drawn me back. A sense that the painter's presence lingered more than I had realized, that the cabin itself was more than walls and wood. It was memory, observation, and perhaps something that could respond. Inside, the light was dim, the shadows long across the wooden floor. Dust motes floated in the pale glow from the windows, moving like tiny spirits caught in slow currents of air. I moved carefully among the easels, tracing the edges of paintings with my eyes, feeling the faint tug of attention that seemed to emanate from the images themselves. But what drew me most was a small, locked drawer in the corner of the painter's desk. I hadn't noticed it before. It was simple wood, unadorned, but the lock was rusted and weak. With a soft click, it gave way, and inside I found a thin, leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and worn. I opened it slowly, breathing gently, careful not to disturb anything. The pages were filled with tight, hurried handwriting, more frantic than the careful notations in the other notebooks. The first entries were mundane, notes on brush techniques, paint mixtures, studies of trees and light. But soon the words shifted, the tone becoming darker, more insistent. The painter wrote of being observed, not by people, not by animals, but by the cabin itself, by the space he inhabited. It watches me. The walls see, the shadows track my movements, I paint and it paints back. I paused, the words pressing against me like a cold hand. I had felt the same sensation in the room, the subtle response of the paintings, the shifting shadows along the walls. To read that someone else had sensed it, that the artist had documented his awareness, made my skin prickle. I turned the page slowly, trying to anchor myself in the text, even as the words seemed to deepen the quiet tension in the cabin. The entries became increasingly fragmented. Descriptions of the forest outside, the creek beyond the trees, and the way light moved across the cabin walls. He wrote of shadows that seemed to lengthen when he turned his back, of the faintest whisper of movement in corners, of the subtle impression that the forest was somehow inside the cabin, pressing in on him. The trees bend toward me. The creek hums with memory. The shadows linger longer than they should. I am never alone, and yet there is no one here. I ran my fingers lightly over the page, feeling the weight of his experience. It was one thing to perceive subtle changes in a painting. It was another to feel the space around you respond, as if it had agency. I looked up at the canvases surrounding me, and for the first time, I wondered whether I had been seeing the paintings move, or if they had always moved slowly, in ways I had not fully noticed. The forest in the oils seemed aware, attentive, perhaps even sentient, recording my gaze as much as I observed it. The journal described nights filled with quiet dread, where the painter could not sleep, where he felt the walls shift imperceptibly, the shadows lean toward him. I lie in bed and the cabin breathes. I see shapes in the corner of my vision. I hear faint scratching as if the wood itself scratches against the air. The paintings, they know I am watching. I shivered, recalling the half-finished canvas at the center of the room, the subtle movement I had sensed yesterday. It was almost as if the painter had been capturing his own paranoia, in every stroke leaving traces of his fear, embedded in the images themselves. I read on, and the words became more urgent, more fragmented. The painter described a growing obsession with the act of observation, with the forest, with the space that surrounded him. He documented small, deliberate marks left in the studio, brushes positioned precisely, canvases tilted, sketches left in corners. Every object, he noted, seemed to respond when he moved, as if the cabin had its own will. I step back and the shadows stretch. I move closer and the trees lean. I cannot escape the attention, and it is relentless. I felt the weight of his experience pressing in on me. The quiet tension of the cabin, the subtle shifts in the canvases, the faint hum of memory in the air, all of it made sense now. The painter had believed the cabin itself had agency, that it could watch, respond, perhaps even judge. And though I had been careful not to disturb anything, I could feel the same presence, the same subtle insistence, as if the cabin remembered him, and me, and everyone who had walked these boards before. Some entries were so fragmented they were almost unreadable, as if the painter's thoughts had raced faster than his hand could keep up. He wrote of footsteps in corners, of faint sighs and whispers, of shadows that moved independently of light. I speak aloud and the shadows shift. I whisper and they mimic me. The cabin paints back, always painting back. I do not know where I end and it begins. I closed my eyes, imagining him in the space, surrounded by his own creations, unable to separate himself from the forest and the walls and the shadows that pressed in on him. There were references to specific paintings I had seen, the clearing, the twisted trees, the empty paths that seemed longer than possible. He described noticing subtle changes, shifts that suggested a consciousness beyond his own. The forest paints itself when I am not looking. The clearing moves. The branches bend. The shadows gather. I cannot leave. I do not want to leave, but I know it follows. I ran a finger along the page and felt an odd sense of kinship, a quiet dread mingled with fascination. The painter had been consumed by this space, by the awareness of the forest and the cabin, yet he had left traces for anyone who might follow, hints of his perception embedded in words and brushstrokes. I could almost hear his voice whispering in the air, urging me to notice, to see the subtle movements, to acknowledge the quiet presence of something beyond observation. The journal grew darker toward the end, describing nights of insomnia, the painter wandering the studio in silence, whispering to the shadows, responding to the movements of the trees outside the windows. I try to close my eyes, but the cabin breathes in rhythm with mine. The paintings move when I look away. The forest leans through the walls. I am part of it now, and it is part of me. The words pressed into my mind, a subtle echo of the tension I had already felt within the room. The cabin was not just a space. It was an experience, an organism of memory, attention, and quiet insistence. I set the journal down slowly, aware of the weight in the room. The paintings seemed to watch. The shadows lingered in corners. The air vibrated with something I could not name. I realized that the painter had captured more than the forest. He had captured the interaction between observer and observed, embedding his paranoia, his attention, and his fear into every stroke. The cabin, in turn, preserved it, extending it to anyone who entered, anyone who noticed, anyone who looked closely enough. I took a deep breath and stepped back from the desk. The air felt thick, charged with memory. The forest outside was quiet, the creek beyond unseen but present, carrying the weight of decades of observation and presence. I knew that in some subtle way the painter's paranoia had been justified. The cabin was aware, not conscious in the way a person is, but alive in memory, in attention, in response. And now I was part of that continuum, another observer woven into the subtle movements, the shadows, and the whispers embedded in every brushstroke. I left the journal where I had found it on the desk and stepped toward the door. The forest beyond the window seemed to shift subtly as I looked, the branches swaying just slightly, the shadows deepening in a way I could not fully explain. I paused, aware that I was leaving part of myself behind in this space, part of my attention, my perception, my acknowledgement. The cabin had claimed me in some quiet, subtle way, just as it had the painter before me. And as I closed the door behind me, the faintest whisper brushed my ear, a sound almost like a sigh carried on the wind. It was not threatening, not urgent, but insistent, a reminder that the cabin, the paintings, and the forest would continue to respond to those who entered, that memory, attention, and observation endure, long after the original life has departed. I decided to stay in the cabin that night. The idea seemed reckless even as I committed to it, but some part of me wanted to immerse myself completely, to understand the painter's world from within, and to see if the quiet movements, the subtle presence I had felt, could extend into the hours of darkness. The forest outside the windows was already deep and muted, the canopy thickening as evening approached, blocking much of the last light. The air carried a faint chill, scented with damp moss and soil, and a quiet anticipation seemed to hang over everything. I lit a small candle on the desk, its flicker trembling in the low ceiling. Shadows leapt along the walls, brushing the edges of the canvases, bending and folding over shapes I had already memorized. Each painting seemed to absorb the flame and exhale it back into the room, subtle, alive, as if responding to the faint movement of air and light. I settled into the worn chair in the corner, trying to breathe slowly, letting my body sink into the quiet rhythm of the cabin. First, nothing changed. I stared at the paintings, tracing the curves of branches, the paths that seemed longer than they should be, the empty clearings that always felt a step away from something just beyond perception. Then, as the candlelight flickered, I noticed the first subtle shift. A shadow in the corner of a canvas stretched slightly, its shape more pronounced than it had been in daylight. I blinked and looked again. It seemed to recede, but the impression lingered, a quiet tension at the edge of my awareness. The moon rose, spilling silver light through the grimy windows. It fell across the easels and walls, illuminating the oil paints in a way that daylight never had. Colors deepened, shadows sharpened, and the forest on canvas seemed to breathe. Branches twisted, leaves shimmered faintly, and the clearings held an almost imperceptible movement. I felt as though I had stepped inside the painter's mind, standing within the world he had created, and the world had noticed me. I moved carefully among the easels, feeling the floorboards creak under my weight, aware that each sound seemed amplified in the stillness. The canvases reacted subtly to my gaze. Shadows shifted along the edges, light seemed to change direction, and in the darker corners, shapes that had been indistinct before became slightly clearer. I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of a clearing, hunched and watching. I blinked, and it was gone, leaving only the suggestion of presence, as though the painting remembered it even when it did not exist. I returned to the half-finished canvas at the center, the clearing I had studied before. Under the moonlight, the scene had transformed. The path seemed longer, the trees denser, the shadows pressing closer. I realized that the cabin, or perhaps the paintings themselves, were not fixed in space or time. They shifted according to my presence, my attention, and perhaps the quiet rhythm of the forest outside. The realization brought a cold shiver to my spine. I was not merely observing the art. I was inside it, part of it, and it was part of me. The air grew colder as the night deepened. I wrapped myself in my jacket and settled into the chair, trying to focus on my breathing to ground myself in the physical world. But the cabin was insistent. Shapes moved along the walls, subtle shifts that were never dramatic but always noticeable. Branches in the paintings arched slightly toward me. Shadows stretched just beyond the light. The clearings seemed deeper, as if they extended into infinite space. I felt a faint vertigo, a sense that the room had expanded beyond its walls, that I was suspended somewhere between reality and the painted forest. I remembered the journal I had found, the painter's words describing the cabin, watching, responding, even painting back. Now, in the soft glow of moonlight, I understood more fully what he had meant. The space was alive with memory and attention, and I was intruding upon it. Each subtle movement, each faint shift in color and shadow, was an acknowledgement of my presence. The cabin had absorbed the painter's fear, his obsession, his attention, and it responded with its own quiet insistence. I closed my eyes briefly, trying to separate imagination from perception, trying to convince myself that the shapes shifting in the moonlight were only shadows, only paint, only tired eyes playing tricks. But when I opened them, the subtle distortions continued. A branch in one painting arched just slightly more than before. The clearing that had seemed empty now held the faintest suggestion of a figure, crouched, observing. I could feel the tension pressing in, soft but relentless, as though the cabin itself had extended its awareness, drawing me into its quiet, patient scrutiny. Hours passed slowly. I lost track of time, aware only of the subtle changes in the light, the quiet shifts in the paintings, and the growing intimacy of the space. I felt as though I were being watched by the forest itself, through the medium of oil and canvas, through the echoes of the painter's perception. The sensation was not frightening in the conventional sense, but it was insistent, pressing, unavoidable. I felt both drawn in and trapped, as if leaving the chair, the cabin, or even the room would disrupt some fragile equilibrium I had entered. I dared to move closer to a small painting near the window, one I had not studied before. It depicted a narrow path winding between trees so twisted and dark they seemed to lean in with intention. Under the moonlight, the path seemed to deepen, extending beyond the edges of the canvas. I could see shadows moving along the undergrowth, subtle and slow, as if aware of my gaze. The air in the cabin grew heavier, carrying the faint scent of paint, turpentine, and damp wood. My heart beat quietly, steadily, but I was conscious of it, aware of how my own attention seemed to feed the subtle life in the room. At some point, I realized I had stopped breathing naturally. I had been holding myself in quiet reverence, afraid that any sudden movement might disturb the delicate balance. I exhaled slowly, letting the tension leave my shoulders, but the shapes on the walls continued their subtle shifting. The paintings were alive in memory and perception, alive in the quiet observation of the cabin itself. I understood then why the painter had become obsessed, why he had documented his paranoia in the journal. The cabin was not a passive space. It was a participant, a recorder, a quiet, sentient witness to those who entered. Moonlight faded gradually, replaced by the dim gray of pre-dawn. The paintings remained subtly active, shadows lingering in corners, branches leaning just so, clearings holding the faint suggestion of movement. I realized that the night had passed in this suspended state, a slow immersion in the painter's perception and the cabin's quiet insistence. I had experienced the forest as he had captured it, but now with an added layer, the knowledge that attention itself could animate, or at least distort, the world he had created. When I finally stepped outside, the forest was calm, quiet, and still. The cabin stood behind me, wooden walls soft in the morning light, windows reflecting the muted sky. Yet even as I walked down the trail, I felt a lingering presence, subtle but insistent. It was not fear that accompanied me. It was awareness, a recognition that I had become part of something larger, something preserved in paint and wood, in memory and attention. The night among the colors had left a mark, quiet but undeniable, in my mind and my senses. Even now, thinking back, I can see the subtle shifts, the shapes that moved in the moonlight, the shadows that lingered just beyond the edges of perception. I remember the pressure of being observed, not in a threatening way, but in a way that demanded recognition and presence. The cabin, the paintings, and the forest had communicated with me through subtle motion and quiet insistence, leaving me with the inescapable awareness that observation itself can animate, preserve, and perhaps even imprison in the softest, slowest way imaginable. And though I had left the cabin behind, the echo of that night remained. The subtle shifts in color and shadow, the quiet, insistent presence of the painter's work, and the weight of memory embedded in the walls and easels lingered, like faint brushstrokes etched into my own perception. I knew I would return someday, compelled by the same quiet curiosity that had drawn me in, to once again walk among the colors and the shadows, and to feel the cabin's patient, watchful presence surrounding me like a forest caught between sleep and wakefulness. I first came across the letters while digging through the local historical society archives, a dusty, dim room that smelled faintly of paper and mildew. The wooden shelves were stacked with files and boxes, each one promising some fragment of forgotten history. I was there to research a string of disappearances in the area, a series of odd cases where families had vanished without a trace, leaving only empty houses and unanswered questions. Most of the documents were dry reports or newspaper clippings, but one small, unmarked box caught my attention, tucked in the corner like it had been waiting for me. Inside, the letters were brittle, yellowed at the edges, tied together with a faded ribbon. The handwriting was elegant, deliberate, but there was a tension in the loops and flourishes that made my stomach tight. The letters described a family cabin far in the woods, where the family had retreated for summers and weekends, but from which they had never returned. There was no explanation, no evidence of struggle, only their absence and the occasional, cryptic note hinting at something they feared. I settled into a chair, unfolding the first letter with care. The ink was smudged in places, as though the writer had paused mid-thought, fingers trembling or perhaps damp with tears. The letter was addressed to a distant relative, recounting the simple joys of their time at the cabin, morning walks by the creek, the sound of the wind through the pines, the quiet evenings spent reading by the fireplace. But as I read, a subtle unease began to creep in. There were hints, small and almost apologetic, that something was not quite right. Shadows that moved oddly in the corner of the eye, the sound of footsteps outside when no one should have been there, the forest seeming to lean closer to the cabin as the days passed. The next letter, dated only a few weeks later, carried a darker tone. The writer mentioned feeling watched, not by people but by the house itself, or perhaps by the surrounding woods. There were descriptions of doors that seemed to close silently behind them, windows reflecting movement that wasn't there, and a persistent feeling of being observed. "The forest does not forget," the letter read in a line underlined twice. "And I fear the cabin remembers too." I paused, the words sticking in my mind. It was the first time the letters suggested more than mere superstition. There was a tangible sense of dread, as though the writer had been trying to warn someone who might come after. I continued through the stack, the stories growing increasingly fragmented, each letter more hurried than the last. The family had written of strange sounds at night, whispers carried on the wind, creaks in the floorboards when the house was supposed to be empty, faint tapping on the windows when the moon was full. There were sketches in the margins, simple pencil outlines of trees, the creek, and the cabin itself, but with subtle distortions. The trees leaning inward, shadows stretching unnaturally, the cabin's angles slightly off, as if drawn from memory that had been warped by fear. One letter stood out. The ink was darker, more rushed, and the paper smelled faintly of smoke. It was addressed to a friend, a plea for understanding. "We are leaving, though I fear it is too late. The cabin watches, it waits, and I cannot tell if it is the house or the forest or both. Do not come here, do not follow. Something in the walls listens. Something beyond the trees is patient. I hope we find safety before it finds us. I felt a chill, the words lingering longer than they should have. There was no signature, only the scratch of a hurried hand, as if the writer had left mid-sentence. The letters ended abruptly after that, leaving only silence and absence. The family's fate remained a mystery, and local records offered no explanation. No search had yielded results, no body, no trace of their belongings beyond what they had left behind in the cabin. It was as if the place had swallowed them whole, leaving only ink and memory behind. And yet, the letters carried a weight, a subtle insistence, as though the writers had known someone would eventually read their warnings. I sat back in the chair, holding the top letter loosely in my hands. The room around me felt suddenly quieter, heavier. I realized that the letters were more than historical documents. They were a bridge to something that had lingered in that cabin, something that left a trace not just in memory, but in perception. I felt a pull, a curiosity that was difficult to resist, a desire to see the cabin for myself, to understand the subtle terror the writers had experienced. The following week, I made arrangements to visit. I gathered supplies, boots, a flashlight, notebooks, and followed the descriptions in the letters, piecing together directions through overgrown trails and narrow paths. The forest grew dense quickly, sunlight muted by a thick canopy, shadows long and silent. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig beneath my boots seemed amplified, carrying a weight that made my skin prickle. I told myself to breathe, to focus on the trail, but the letters, warnings echoed in my mind. The cabin watches, the forest remembers. As I drew closer, the sense of anticipation shifted into something heavier. I could see glimpses of a clearing between the trees, just as the letters had described. The creek murmured softly in the distance, its sound oddly familiar, as though I had walked this path in dreams before. And then I saw it, the cabin, hidden partially by undergrowth, weathered and silent, its wooden walls muted gray with age. The windows reflected the muted light of late afternoon, and for a moment, I felt as though it were staring back at me. I stepped closer, boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. The air felt colder here, stiller. I could smell the faint scent of damp wood and decay, the faintest hint of smoke lingering in the corners. The forest around the cabin was unnaturally quiet. Birds were absent, and even the wind seemed hesitant. I thought of the letters again, the warnings, the pleas, the desperate scribbles, and a knot formed in my stomach. It was as though the forest itself had preserved the fear, as if the memory of the family's terror remained embedded in every leaf, every branch, every shadow. I circled the cabin slowly, taking note of the details described in the letters. The slight lean of the front porch, the cracked window panes, the way the creek curved just beyond the back of the house. Everything matched, yet there was an unsettling stillness, a perfection in the decay that made the place feel watched, measured, deliberate. I could imagine the family inside, moving quietly, feeling the same oppressive attention that pressed on me now. I could almost hear the echoes of their voices in the air, faint and carried on the wind, warning me or perhaps pleading. For a long moment I simply stood there, listening to the soft murmur of the forest, the quiet pressure of presence in the cabin. The letters had led me here, but the reality of the space was more immediate, more insistent than I had anticipated. I realized that curiosity was a dangerous thing, that the act of reading, of observing, had drawn me into the same quiet, watchful orbit that had ensnared the family. And yet I could not turn away, not entirely. The weight of the letters, the lingering questions, the desire to understand what had happened, pulled me forward, step by careful step, toward the doorway of the cabin and the mysteries waiting inside. The first thing I noticed as I approached the cabin was the porch. It was simple, wooden, with paint long faded and peeled by years of sun and rain. A swing hung loosely from thick ropes, and it rocked ever so slightly in the wind. I could see no one around, no footprints in the soft earth, no signs of recent visitors, but the movement was deliberate enough to make me pause. I felt the hair at the back of my neck stand on end, not out of fear exactly, but a quiet awareness that the space was alive in a way that ordinary cabins are not. I took a step forward, boots sinking slightly in the damp forest floor, and the swing creaked again. I wondered if it had been set in motion by a stray breeze, but the air was still. The trees around me stood rigid, silent observers, their branches swaying only with the faintest sighs of wind. Yet the swing moved as if responding to something I could not see, some subtle rhythm in the atmosphere that connected it to the cabin itself. I stopped walking, waiting, listening to the soft scrape of rope against wood. The cabin's front door was closed, its surface marred with small cracks and the faint stains of weather. I reached out and ran my fingers over the rough paint, feeling the texture, the history embedded in the grains. It seemed to pulse with quiet memory, and I remembered the letters I had read, the family's descriptions of sounds in the night, the feeling of being watched, the persistent whisper of the forest pressing against their walls. The knowledge settled on me like a second skin, making each step heavier, each breath more deliberate. I moved closer to the porch, my eyes tracing the outlines of the swing, the uneven planks beneath my feet. The forest beyond seemed to hold its breath, every rustle of leaves amplified, every bird call absent. The quiet pressure in the air felt almost intentional, as if the trees themselves had leaned inward to observe. I realized then that the cabin was not just a building. It was a space charged with the memory of the family who had vanished here, and perhaps with something more, something subtle and enduring, like a quiet echo of fear. Stepping onto the porch, I noticed the floorboards creak softly under my weight. The swing responded with a slow, measured motion, rocking slightly more, as if acknowledging me. I hesitated, sensing that the cabin was aware of my presence in ways I could not fully comprehend. Every instinct told me to leave, to step back into the forest where I felt grounded, but curiosity, quiet, insistent, pushed me forward. I wanted to see what had been left behind, what traces of the family's last days had lingered here. The swing stopped moving as I settled onto the porch steps, careful to make no sudden movements. I breathed slowly, trying to anchor myself in the physical sensation of the wood beneath my hands and boots. Yet even as I focused on the tangible, I could not shake the sense of observation, the impression that something unseen was watching, waiting. I recalled the letters again, the words that had warned of the cabin's attention, of the forest's memory. I felt that attention now, subtle, patient, woven into the air and the shadows. I leaned back slightly, letting my eyes wander over the cabin's exterior. The windows were clouded with grime and age, and I could not see inside clearly. But from the faint reflections of the trees, the glass seemed to shift, to ripple slightly as though alive. The swing creaked again, and I realized I was holding my breath. It moved slowly, deliberately, and for a brief moment I imagined a figure seated there, watching, waiting, a remnant of the family that had vanished. But when I blinked, there was only the empty swing and the quiet forest beyond. I thought about stepping inside, about crossing the threshold into the unknown, but the porch itself seemed to hold me in place. There was a rhythm to the space, a subtle pulse in the air, and I felt as if I had entered a domain that was not entirely physical. The cabin, the swing, the trees around it, they were all participants in some silent, patient ritual. I could almost hear the echo of footsteps that were not mine, a soft, deliberate packing from within, carried through the walls and into the shadows of the porch. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours. Time seemed to stretch differently here. I felt the weight of history pressing in on me, the memory of the family captured in the weathered wood and the faint movements in the swing. I reached out and touched the ropes, feeling the coarse fibers under my fingers. The swing moved slightly more, responding to the touch in a way that was not mechanical. I stepped back, suddenly aware of the thin line between observation and participation, between seeing and being seen. I shifted my gaze to the forest beyond the clearing. The trees were tall and dense, their branches intertwining to create walls of green that seemed to close the world off. The air was still, almost unnaturally so, and the quiet was thick enough to press against my ears. I remembered the letters again, the family's descriptions of sounds in the night, of doors closing silently, windows reflecting movement that should not have been there. The memory of their fear wrapped around me, tangible and present, and I felt a subtle shiver move down my spine. I leaned forward on the porch railing, studying the cabin's front door and windows. I imagined what it must have been like for the family, arriving for a quiet weekend, only to find the space growing stranger with each passing hour. I could almost feel the weight of the walls, the silent insistence of the structure itself, pressing gently but firmly on anyone who entered. It was not malevolent exactly, but it was attentive, aware, and infinitely patient. The wind shifted slightly, moving through the trees with a soft sigh, and the swing creaked again, a measured, deliberate sound. I realized that the motion had been almost imperceptible, but I could feel its insistence. It was as if the cabin were acknowledging me, testing me, inviting me to cross the threshold. My heart beat steadily, each pulse amplified in the quiet. I felt the tension pressing gently against my chest, a subtle, insistent weight that demanded recognition. Eventually, I stepped forward onto the porch floor and felt the wood groan softly beneath my boots. The swing moved in response, a slow, subtle rocking that seemed to follow the rhythm of my steps. I looked at the windows, clouded and reflective, and wondered what the family had seen in these same panes, what shadows had lingered just beyond perception. I could sense the quiet patience of the cabin, the way it preserved memory and observation, as though the walls themselves were alive with awareness. I settled on the edge of the porch, my back against the rough siding, and let my eyes wander over the small clearing that led into the forest. The creek murmured faintly in the distance, carrying the sound of water that had likely been there for decades, unchanged and patient. I could almost hear the faint echoes of laughter or conversation, ghostly impressions left by the family in this very spot. And as the swing rocked slowly beside me, I understood that the cabin did not merely remember, it responded, subtly, imperceptibly, to anyone who paused long enough to notice. The sun dipped lower behind the trees, casting long, slanted shadows across the clearing. The swing's movement grew slower, more deliberate, and the quiet around me deepened, stretching the seconds into something tangible, something that pressed against perception. I knew then that I could not linger too long without crossing some unseen threshold, without allowing the cabin's quiet insistence to claim a part of my attention. Yet I could not move either. The pull was gentle but unrelenting, a quiet fascination that bound me to the empty porch and its slowly rocking swing. As evening descended fully, I finally stood and stepped away from the railing, each motion deliberate. The swing responded once more, a soft creak in the quiet forest, and I felt a faint sense of acknowledgement, a recognition from the space itself. I would enter the cabin soon, I knew that. But for now I remained on the porch, absorbing the subtle presence, the quiet memory of those who had vanished, and the patient, watchful awareness of the space that had outlasted them. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the swing rocking softly, and I understood with a deep, quiet certainty that the cabin had already noticed me. I stepped across the threshold of the cabin, feeling the wooden floorboards groan beneath my boots. The air inside was cooler than outside, carrying the faint scent of damp wood and something older, something that belonged to memory itself. Dust hung in soft clouds, disturbed briefly as I moved, settling again like the quiet breaths of a place that had waited patiently for decades. For a moment, I paused, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through grime-streaked windows. The first thing that caught my attention was the toys. A small wooden train lay abandoned in the corner, its paint chipped and dulled by time. A stuffed rabbit, one ear torn and threadbare, sat propped against a chair. Building blocks scattered in uneven piles were coated in the pale gray of dust that had settled and stayed, unclaimed for years. The arrangement of the objects was strangely deliberate, as though someone had left in a hurry, leaving everything in place, untouched, preserved. I walked slowly among them, my fingers brushing over the coarse surfaces. The toys were ordinary, the kinds that any child might have loved, but in this silence they became eerie relics. There was a sense of absence in their stillness, a suggestion that the lives they represented had stopped abruptly. I imagined little hands leaving them mid-play, little voices echoing in the rooms before fading into nothing. The thought sent a quiet shiver down my spine, not of terror exactly, but of weighty awareness, history compressed into tiny, inanimate forms. On a small table near the window, I noticed a sketchbook. The cover was worn, the edges frayed, and the pages inside were filled with childish drawings, houses, trees, stick figures, and smiling suns. But even these innocent images had a subtle unease. The stick figures were placed oddly, some drawn larger than others, their arms stretching toward unseen points. Trees leaned over paths as if watching, and the sun seemed to follow the viewer with an unnerving persistence. I flipped through the pages carefully, the paper soft under my fingers, and felt the faint echo of little lives paused mid-story. I moved deeper into the cabin, past the living area, toward what must have been the children's bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, squeaking softly as I nudged it with my hand. Inside, the room smelled faintly of old wood and faint mildew, the shadows stretching across faded wallpaper patterned with animals and stars. A small bed lay neatly made, the blanket stiff and coated with dust. A doll sat upright against the pillow, its eyes wide open, gazing silently into the room as though waiting for someone who would never return. The feeling of abruptness grew heavier as I explored. There were shoes lined up by the door, worn and small, some with faint traces of mud. A half-finished puzzle was scattered across a low table, pieces missing as if the game had been abandoned mid-play. A music box rested on the dresser, its key missing, the brass tarnished, quiet now after decades of silence. Every object seemed to whisper of a moment frozen, a sudden interruption, leaving the cabin suspended in time. I sat on the edge of the small bed, careful not to disturb anything, and let my eyes wander. The window caught the last light of afternoon, illuminating motes of dust that danced lazily in the air. The room felt alive in its quiet stillness, as though the memories embedded in the toys and furniture pressed against perception. I could almost hear the faint echoes of laughter, the soft patter of small feet across the floor, the whisper of voices carried on the breeze through slightly open windows. In the corner, a wooden rocking horse leaned slightly, its curved runners pressed into the worn floor. I approached it cautiously, running my hand over the smooth, chipped paint. For a moment I could swear it shifted beneath my touch, just slightly, like a breath of memory moved through it. I stepped back quickly, blinking. It was still motionless, yet the feeling lingered as if the room itself remembered motion, remembered presence, remembered the people who had once filled it. I moved toward the fireplace next, noticing small objects left on the mantel. A pair of tiny shoes, a faded photograph in a cracked frame, a small carved wooden figure. Everything was coated in dust, and yet each object seemed to carry a residue of life, an imprint of the family that had vanished. I ran my fingers over the photograph, careful not to damage it. It depicted the family smiling on a sunny day outside the cabin, unaware, perhaps, of the forest's attention, of the cabin's quiet watchfulness. I felt a pang in my chest, a connection to the lives that had been abruptly interrupted, the ordinary interrupted by something unseen. I returned to the toys, picking up a small wooden block and turning it over in my hand. The letters I had read before came back vividly, the words describing sudden fear, the forest pressing in, the family feeling observed. I could imagine the children playing here, unaware of the pressure that grew outside these walls, the quiet presence that lingered in the corners, waiting. The simple joy of childhood frozen in dust, the absence of laughter resonating louder than any sound. A sudden thought struck me. Had the family left in a panic, or had something darker moved them from this room? The questions had no answers, only speculation. Yet the objects themselves felt like remnants of the interruption, proof that lives had been paused mid-motion. I imagined someone, or something, standing just beyond perception, waiting while the family vanished, leaving the echo of existence behind. The toys, still arranged as they were, seemed to suggest order, but it was an order imposed by absence, by sudden cessation. I continued to walk through the cabin slowly, taking in each detail. In the kitchen, small dishes sat stacked neatly, covered in dust but unbroken. On the counter, a cup leaned at an angle as though set down in haste. The rooms were silent, still, yet imbued with memory, as though the walls themselves retained the echo of life that had once filled them. The objects spoke in a quiet language of interruption and disappearance, a language that resonated in the chest, not with fear but with weighty comprehension. I found myself returning repeatedly to the children's room, drawn to the small details. A tiny chair was tipped slightly, a book lay open with illustrations frozen mid-scene, and the rocking horse leaned just so, a subtle suggestion of motion remembered. I sat again on the edge of the bed, letting the quiet settle around me, feeling the weight of absence in the space. The cabin, the toys, the dust, they were all participants in a memory that had been interrupted, a story left unfinished. The more I observed, the more I felt that the cabin itself had preserved these moments, had held them in quiet reverence for decades. It was patient, attentive, and perhaps aware. Every object, every toy, every piece of furniture seemed to echo the presence of the family, a subtle imprint left in wood, cloth, and dust. I understood in that quiet moment that the cabin was not just a building. It was a keeper of histories, a witness to life interrupted and never resumed. Eventually, I stood and stepped back, taking a final glance at the room. The toys remained still, dust-laden witnesses to lives abruptly paused. The shadows lengthened as the sun dipped lower, casting the faintest illumination on the abandoned objects. I felt the pull of the letters once more, the warnings embedded in ink, the sense of attention that the forest and cabin had held for decades. And as I moved toward the door to explore the rest of the house, I carried with me the quiet, lingering presence of those who had vanished, echoes in wood, cloth, and dust, patient and eternal. Night settled over the cabin like a slow, heavy blanket, pressing against the walls and creeping through the cracks in the windows. The sun had long dipped below the horizon, leaving only the pale, hesitant light of the moon filtering through the glass. The forest outside was quiet, unnaturally so, and the cabin itself seemed to absorb every sound, holding it in the shadows until I became acutely aware of the smallest noises, the faint creak of a floorboard, the subtle groan of the walls settling with age. I had spent the evening exploring, moving slowly from room to room, absorbing the remnants of lives paused mid-motion. The toys, the dust-covered furniture, the faint traces of meals left uneaten. They all whispered in their silence, and I felt the weight of the family's absence pressing gently but insistently against my chest. I lit a small lantern I had brought, its soft glow illuminating the cabin in warm circles, though the corners remained shrouded in darkness. It was then I heard the first sound, a faint, deliberate step, soft on the old wooden floor yet distinct enough to make me freeze mid-breath. I listened, holding the lantern closer, heart steady but tense. The sound came again, a slow, measured footfall echoing down the hallway just beyond the room I occupied. The steps were light, careful, and impossibly deliberate. I told myself it was the house settling, the boards shifting with the night air, but the rhythm was too precise, too deliberate to be purely mechanical. I set the lantern down on a small table, its light shaking slightly in my hands as I approached the hallway. Each step I took toward the source was measured, quiet, trying not to disturb the delicate balance of silence. The footsteps did not stop. They continued, faint but persistent, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. I could feel their presence before I could see it, a subtle chill in the air, a pressure that brushed against my awareness like a gentle, cold wind. The hallway was narrow, lined with faded wallpaper and faint scratches that had marked the passage of time. Shadows pooled in the corners, and I felt as though the darkness itself was watching, patient and deliberate. The footsteps echoed again, closer now, pausing briefly near a closed door, then continuing down the hall. I held my breath, straining to listen, and in that stillness I felt the sense of being observed, not by a single presence but by many. The family, perhaps, lingering in the spaces where they had vanished, leaving only echoes of movement in their wake. I moved forward slowly, each footfall deliberate and careful, and the footsteps responded, fading just slightly, then resuming their rhythm. I could not see anyone, yet the sensation of proximity was undeniable. The air grew colder as I proceeded, each room I passed feeling heavier, more insistent, as if the cabin itself were alive with memory. I recalled the letters, the warnings etched in ink about sudden fear, doors closing on their own, windows reflecting movement that shouldn't have existed. The footsteps were now more than sound. They were a reminder, a quiet, patient insistence of lives interrupted. I paused near one of the bedrooms, lantern held high, and the steps stopped. Silence enveloped me, heavy and deliberate. I could feel the weight of attention pressing from just beyond the doorway, something unseen observing my hesitation, testing my awareness. My mind raced, imagining the children stepping lightly through the rooms, the parents moving quietly, each aware of the forest's subtle presence and the cabin's attention. Yet there was no movement I could see, only the cold pressure that brushed against perception and the faint echo of a rhythm remembered. I took another step and the footsteps resumed, this time moving toward the kitchen, pausing again as I followed. The sound was soft, almost respectful yet unmistakable, a measured presence walking just out of sight. I felt my chest tighten, not from fear exactly, but from the intensity of awareness, the sense that every step I took was mirrored by unseen companions, echoes of those who had vanished decades ago. Each footfall seemed to carry memory, a faint imprint of movement preserved in the air, in the floor, in the walls themselves. I moved slowly, deliberately, tracing the steps through the cabin. In the dining room, the footsteps paused near the edge of a dusty table. I could almost see the shadow of a child leaning over a puzzle, a mother adjusting a chair, a father glancing toward the window. It was illusion, perhaps, the mind filling gaps, but the weight of presence was undeniable. I breathed slowly, reminding myself that the house had held these moments in its structure, in its silence, in the faint creaks and echoes that had persisted across time. The lantern illuminated a small hallway leading toward the back of the cabin, and I felt the steps move ahead, stopping just beyond a closed door. I approached cautiously, hand resting lightly on the knob. The footsteps paused again, patient, deliberate, as if the house itself were waiting for my decision. I opened the door slowly, revealing a small room, the children's bedroom I had explored earlier. Dust-coated toys lay in their corners, the rocking horse leaning just slightly as though it had been disturbed recently. The air was cold, heavier here than in the rest of the cabin, and I could feel the pull of memory pressing against my skin. I stepped inside, lantern held high, and the footsteps stopped entirely. The silence was profound, almost tangible, yet I could sense a presence lingering, patient, and deliberate. I walked to the center of the room, feeling the chill settle around me, and realized that the footsteps were no longer needed. They were embedded in the memory of the space, preserved as echoes that responded only to awareness. The cabin had made its mark on the very air, and I understood that these faint, deliberate sounds were not always heard. They were felt, carried in the body as a pressure, a quiet reminder of absence and lingering presence. I sat on the edge of the bed, allowing the lantern to illuminate the room in soft, gentle light. The footsteps had ceased, but their impression remained, a lingering rhythm embedded in the walls and floorboards. I could almost hear whispers in the quiet, faint murmurs of conversation, soft laughter, the creak of a rocking chair, the shuffle of small feet. The family had vanished, but their presence persisted, a delicate imprint woven into every corner, every shadow, every object left behind. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours, and I remained still, letting the quiet press against me. The lantern's light cast gentle patterns on the walls, and the dust motes danced like tiny specters in the glow. I realized then that the cabin did not merely hold memory. It preserved it, active and patient, capable of replaying its moments for those who entered with enough awareness to notice. The footsteps were part of that preservation, a subtle rhythm that reminded me of the lives abruptly paused, the stories left unfinished. I rose slowly, setting the lantern on the dresser and moved toward the doorway. The chill followed me into the hallway, pressing gently against my back. I could feel the cabin's attention tracking my movement, patient and deliberate, and I understood that my presence had become another thread in its quiet, woven narrative. The steps had faded, but their memory persisted, a reminder that the past was never truly absent, only waiting to be perceived. I stepped into the hallway, feeling the floorboards groan softly beneath my boots. The air was thick with history, with memory, with the quiet insistence of unseen observers. The footsteps were gone, yet the impression of presence remained, pressing gently, inexorably against the edges of perception. I walked slowly toward the front of the cabin, knowing that the night would hold more revelations, more whispers, more subtle interactions with those who had vanished, and with the house itself patient and watchful. Outside, the forest was dark, the shadows pressing against the cabin like silent guardians. Inside, I felt the lingering presence of the family in every corner, every object, every floorboard. The footsteps had come and gone, but their message was clear. The lives that had been interrupted remained part of the cabin, their echoes preserved in patient memory, waiting for anyone who cared to listen, to feel, to remember. And as I finally made my way toward the doorway, the cabin seemed to exhale, settling into quiet once more, leaving only the faintest impression of movement. The echo of lives paused, and the patient, enduring awareness of a place that would never forget. I stepped out of the cabin and into the night, the door closing behind me with a soft sigh that echoed faintly in the empty space. The air outside felt heavier than I remembered from earlier, dense with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The forest pressed in on all sides, tall trees standing like sentinels, their dark forms blurred in the moonlight. It was quiet, too quiet. There was no rustle of leaves, no distant bird call, no insects buzzing in the undergrowth. The stillness felt deliberate, almost conscious, as though the forest itself had paused to observe. I took a slow step onto the narrow path, boots crunching faintly against the fallen leaves. The sound felt loud in the oppressive silence, each footfall echoing briefly, then swallowed immediately by the dense darkness. I glanced back at the cabin, its silhouette barely visible against the moonlit clearing. The faint glow of the lantern I had left inside flickered through the window, and for a moment I could swear I saw a shadow shift behind it, subtle and deliberate. I told myself it was my imagination, the residue of what I had witnessed inside, the echoes of presence pressing against memory. The path ahead was uneven, twisted with roots and hidden dips that threatened to catch my boots. I moved carefully, one hand brushing against tree bark for balance, feeling the rough texture and grounding myself in the physical world. Yet the forest felt uncanny. It was as though every tree, every bush, every shadow was attuned to my presence, watching, waiting. I remembered the letters I had read, the stories of sudden vanishings, and the quiet insistence that the cabin and its surroundings held secrets that never fully left. The memory of those warnings pressed against me, gentle but unrelenting. A faint breeze moved through the trees, rustling leaves softly, but it brought no relief. The air remained thick and still, carrying a subtle chill that pressed against my skin. I paused, listening, trying to distinguish between natural sounds and something else, something deliberate, something patient. It was then that I felt it, a subtle pressure at the edge of perception, a sensation that I was not entirely alone. My chest tightened slightly, not from fear but from awareness, as though the forest itself was alive with memory, with echoes of those who had vanished here, moving just beyond sight. I continued down the path, each step deliberate, boots pressing softly against the earth. The forest seemed to stretch on endlessly, the path twisting in ways that felt unfamiliar despite its simplicity. Shadows pooled heavily in the undergrowth, and I felt the faintest impression of movement, not enough to see, but enough to sense. It was like the forest itself remembered the lives that had intersected with it, preserving their presence in the spaces between trees, in the soft pressure of air against skin, in the weight of quiet that seemed almost tangible. I thought about the family who had lived in the cabin, about their sudden disappearance. The toys, the abandoned meals, the faint echoes of footsteps I had heard inside. It all lingered in my mind as I walked. The forest seemed to carry that memory, stretching it outward, folding it into the shadows and the stillness. I could feel it pressing on me, subtle and persistent, like a whisper that could not be heard but could be felt. Each step I took seemed to answer it, to acknowledge it, to respect it. At times, the moonlight broke through the branches in thin, pale streaks, illuminating patches of moss and fallen leaves. The ground glimmered faintly, but the light was not comforting. It was clinical, exposing surfaces without revealing the forest's deeper secrets. I kept my eyes moving, scanning, trying to anchor myself in the tangible. Yet every illuminated patch seemed to deepen the shadows beyond, as though revealing only what the forest allowed, hiding everything else. The sensation was disorienting and beautiful in its own quiet way, a subtle tension that demanded attention without urgency. A branch snapped somewhere to my left, a faint crack that might have been a falling twig, might have been something else. I stopped, holding my breath, listening. The silence returned almost immediately, heavy and complete, and I exhaled slowly. I realized that I was not entirely walking alone. There was a presence here, patient and deliberate, lingering in the dark spaces between trees. It was not threatening in a conventional sense, but it was insistent, a subtle awareness pressing against the edges of my perception. I felt it everywhere at once, the forest attentive to my passage. I tried to remember simple, grounding thoughts, light, air, the smell of wet leaves, but the oppressive quiet kept pulling me inward, toward memory, toward the feeling of being watched. My own footsteps seemed louder now, sharper, echoing faintly and then disappearing, leaving only the subtle pressure of the unseen. It reminded me of the cabin, the way the family's presence lingered even after they had vanished. The forest seemed like an extension of that space, carrying the quiet insistence of lives interrupted, preserving them in shadow and stillness. The path curved slightly, leading me toward a small creek I had noticed earlier. The water whispered softly over the rocks, a faint murmur barely audible against the silence. I approached carefully, stepping onto smooth stones at the edge, and knelt to touch the water. It was cold and clear, moving endlessly, yet carrying a weight I could not name. I thought about the family, about their lives intertwined with this forest, about the small, quiet tragedies that had unfolded here. I felt a faint chill run up my arm, not from the water, but from the sense of memory embedded in the place, in the stones, in the water itself. I stayed by the creek for several minutes, letting the subtle murmur of water anchor me, grounding myself in the tactile world. But even there, the forest's awareness pressed in, patient and deliberate. The shadows seemed deeper near the banks, stretching toward me, attentive and observant. I could feel the echoes of footsteps, the faintest impressions of movement, as though the family's story continued just beyond perception, carried in the patterns of the forest, in the stillness that refused to relent. Eventually, I stood and continued along the path, boots soft against moss and fallen leaves. I moved slowly, deliberately, attuned to the forest's rhythms, feeling the gentle pull of memory, of presence. The silence was almost sacred, a quiet insistence that demanded acknowledgement without urgency. I realized that the forest was more than a backdrop to the cabin's story. It was an extension of it, preserving echoes, observing, waiting, patient in a way that humans could scarcely comprehend. The night deepened and the moon rose higher, casting a thin, cold light across the landscape. I walked with care, each step measured, each breath deliberate. I could feel the forest pressing closer, not threatening, not overt, but aware, as if carrying the weight of lives interrupted, of stories left unfinished. I understood then that the family's disappearance was not an isolated event, but part of a continuum, preserved in the shadows, in the stillness, in the very air I breathed. I reached a small clearing where the path opened slightly, and for a moment I allowed myself to look back. The cabin was barely visible, its silhouette dark and quiet against the night sky. I felt the weight of its presence, the memory of footsteps, toys, abandoned meals, and patient observation pressing gently across the distance. It was not gone, and the forest had not let it be. I knew with a quiet certainty that the story of the family was far from over. It persisted in the shadows, in the creek, in the trees, and in the silence that stretched endlessly around me. I stepped forward again, leaving the clearing, moving along the path that led back toward the main road. Each step was deliberate, careful, carrying me physically away but not spiritually. The forest seemed to release me slowly, as if letting go of a story only partially shared. The silence remained, patient and insistent, a constant reminder that absence is not erasure and that memory, once embedded in a place, endures beyond perception. The air grew cooler as I approached the edge of the woods, and the faint sounds of distant night, crickets, the wind through tall grass, began to return. The forest's attention seemed to recede, but I knew it had not abandoned me entirely. I felt it in the lingering weight of quiet, in the subtle impressions pressed into my awareness, in the sense that I carried a story with me now, a story not yet finished, preserved in shadow, memory, and patient observation. As I finally emerged onto the open road, the trees behind me receding into darkness, I took a deep breath. The night was no longer oppressive, but the feeling of presence remained, quiet and persistent. I understood that I had not truly left the cabin or the forest. The story of the family, their lives interrupted, their memory preserved, had followed me. It lingered in subtle ways, in every shadow, in every whisper of wind, in the silence that stretched beyond the path. And I knew, with a gentle, unsettling certainty, that the forest and the cabin would continue to watch, to remember, and to hold on to the lives it had once known, patient and enduring. The night had changed me. I had walked into silence and emerged carrying it, carrying the echoes of those who had vanished, preserved in wood, dust, and shadow. The forest remained quiet, but it was a quiet that spoke, a quiet that remembered, and I felt its patient insistence in every step as I moved further away. The story was far from over, and I knew I would carry it with me, quietly, unrelentingly, for as long as I remembered the sound of the cabin, the toys, and the forest's silent watch. The path appeared unexpectedly, cutting through the forest like a thin scar of dirt and fallen leaves. It was narrow, barely wide enough for a single person to walk comfortably, and bordered on both sides by thick growth that seemed to lean inward, pressing against me as if to observe. I had heard whispers in town about this trail, a forgotten route locals avoided, a place where stories of strange rituals and nightly chants had long been told in hushed voices. The warnings had intrigued me more than they frightened me, and curiosity had carried me this far, step by cautious step. Air was heavy, almost damp, with the scent of wet earth and decomposing leaves. My boots pressed into the soft ground with each step, leaving small impressions that vanished behind me in the uneven terrain. The forest was quiet, almost unnervingly so, and I found myself straining to hear anything beyond the sound of my own movement. Occasionally, a twig snapped somewhere off the path, sharp and sudden, and I froze, heart tightening, listening. But each time, nothing followed, only silence, thick and patient. I paused to study the trees lining the trail. They were tall, ancient, and strangely gnarled, their branches intertwining overhead to form a loose canopy. Moonlight filtered through the leaves in faint, trembling shafts, casting soft, uneven patterns across the ground. The effect was subtle but unsettling, a sense of movement where there was none. Shadows shifted faintly in the corner of my vision, shapes bending and stretching in ways that made my pulse quicken even as I told myself it was only imagination. A breeze whispered through the treetops, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke and something sweeter, almost like burning incense. It tugged at my jacket, brushing my hair against my face, and I shivered. The sound reminded me of the rumors I had heard, the hermit who lived at the end of this trail, conducting strange rituals, singing or chanting late into the night. Some claimed to hear his voice echoing through the forest, though none had dared approach the cabin directly. I told myself these were just stories, attempts to explain what no one truly understood, but the scent in the air made my curiosity spike. The path curved slightly, revealing glimpses of the terrain beyond. Moss-covered stones and fallen branches littered the ground, and I stepped carefully, avoiding unseen roots that could easily trip me. I noticed faint markings on some of the tree trunks, scratches that could have been old, the bark grown over them with time, yet deliberate, as though someone had marked a trail or made a warning. My hand brushed against one of the trees, tracing the faded gouges. There was no question that someone had been here, had left traces that persisted, subtle and insistent. I moved forward and the silence grew heavier, pressing against my ears and lungs. It wasn't an ordinary silence. It felt watchful, aware. Each step seemed to echo faintly in the distance, as though the forest itself was replaying my passage, quietly nodding it. I paused again, letting my ears adjust, trying to separate the natural sounds from something else, something deliberate. For a long moment, there was nothing but the soft rustle of leaves overhead, the faint scuff of my boots on the dirt, and my own breathing. Yet the weight of attention was unmistakable. As I continued, the path opened slightly, revealing a small clearing ahead. And there, just beyond a cluster of twisted trees, I saw it, the cabin. It was modest, made of weathered logs that had darkened over time, the roof sagging slightly in the middle. Smoke curled faintly from a thin chimney, though the moonlight revealed no figure tending to it. Windows stared back at me like empty eyes, dark and reflective, and I felt a strange shiver run down my spine. Even from this distance, the structure seemed alive, as though it acknowledged my presence. I approached cautiously, boots crunching softly on the undergrowth that had begun to reclaim the edges of the path. The air grew warmer here, heavier with the scent of wood smoke and something faintly sweet, like dried herbs. I could almost hear the faintest hum, a vibration carried through the air that seemed to originate from within the cabin. My pulse quickened, though I forced myself to slow my breathing to stay calm, to observe without rushing. The forest had been quiet until now, and I sensed the cabin's influence had begun to extend beyond its walls, shaping the very space around it. I circled the structure slowly, noting details as carefully as I could. The door was simple, wooden, worn smooth from years of use. The windows were clouded with grime, making it impossible to see inside clearly, though I thought I glimpsed faint shadows moving just beyond the glass. The porch creaked softly under my boots, though no wind stirred it. The swing hanging from the rafters moved slightly, back and forth, as if nudged by a presence I could not see. I stopped, holding my breath, and the movement ceased. It was a deliberate, almost knowing pause, and I felt my hair stand on end. I leaned closer to one of the windows, straining to see inside. The glass was cold under my fingers, grimy and opaque, and I caught glimpses of the interior, a sparse room, faintly lit by candlelight or perhaps moonlight filtering through cracks in the roof. There were objects scattered on a table, shapes that suggested jars, tools, and something else I couldn't immediately identify. The hum I had noticed earlier seemed to grow slightly, a vibration beneath my feet, subtle and insistent, almost like the building itself was breathing. I pulled back, heart pounding softly, and stepped to the side. The forest around me remained quiet, the trees motionless, attentive. I realized then that I had become part of a rhythm, a careful interaction between the cabin, the forest, and myself. Each movement I made was observed, noted, absorbed by the stillness. The idea was unnerving, though not in the immediate sharp way of fear. It was a slow, creeping awareness, the kind that seeps into your chest and settles there, quiet and patient. I noticed faint symbols etched into the logs near the base of the cabin, simple scratches that formed shapes I couldn't immediately understand. They were crude, deliberate, and carried a faint odor of resin or burned wood. I crouched, examining them more closely. There was a rhythm to their placement, a pattern that suggested intentionality, as though the markings were part of some practice or ritual. I could not determine if they were warnings, messages, or remnants of the hermit's daily life, but the sense of purpose was undeniable. A soft noise caught my attention, a faint shift in the underbrush to my left. I froze, lantern held low, straining to see beyond the trees. Nothing moved, yet I could feel the gaze of something, or someone watching, patient and deliberate. My thoughts returned to the stories I had heard. Villagers speaking in hushed tones of chants, of strange gatherings, of lights flickering in the cabin late at night. I wondered if I had stepped into one of those stories, if the forest and the cabin together had drawn me here with careful patience, weaving their quiet power into every step I took. The night grew deeper, the moon climbing higher, casting faint light across the clearing. I stepped closer to the porch, noting the intricate carvings along the railing, symbols similar to those etched into the logs. My hand traced the grooves carefully, feeling the deliberate work of someone who had spent long hours crafting them, practicing them, perhaps invoking them. The sense of history pressed against me, weighty and slow, a reminder that lives and practices linger long after people themselves are gone. I took a final step back, glancing once more at the cabin before moving down the path to find a safer distance. The forest resumed its watchful silence, patient and deliberate, leaving me aware of my smallness, my intrusion into a space carefully preserved by attention and ritual. I knew then that the hermit's story, the whispered warnings, the nightly chants, they were part of something larger, a quiet network of memory, presence, and deliberate practice. And as I walked away, I felt the forest and the cabin lingering behind me, observing, waiting, patient as the night itself. Even as the path curved and the trees opened slightly to reveal glimpses of the surrounding wilderness, I could feel the pull of the cabin, a subtle insistence in the air. The experience was not one of terror but of awareness, a creeping recognition that some places hold more than just wood and stone, that silence can carry weight, and that presence can exist without form. I carried this feeling with me, a patient, persistent reminder of the hermit, his rituals, and the path that had drawn me here. And so I continued along the lonely path, boots pressing softly into earth that seemed to remember each step, forest and cabin alike observing with patient insistence. The night stretched endlessly, quiet, heavy, and aware, and I understood that the story of this place was only beginning, patient in its unfolding, waiting for those who dared to notice. Stepping inside the cabin, the air changed immediately. It was heavier here, warmer in a way that pressed against my skin, carrying scents that were sharp, almost herbal, and a faint, lingering smoke that made my eyes water slightly. The door creaked softly behind me as I closed it, sealing myself in the hermit's world. For a moment, I just stood there, letting my eyes adjust to the dim interior. Moonlight filtered weakly through the grimy windows, casting long shadows across the walls, uneven and quivering, and the faint glow of a half-burned candle added a tremulous warmth to the room. The cabin was small, cramped, and yet every surface seemed full of purpose. Wooden shelves lined the walls, filled with jars of dried plants, small bottles of unknown liquids, and stacks of folded papers yellowed with age. In the center of the floor, a circle of candles surrounded an assortment of half-carved wooden figures. Some were simple, almost childlike. Others were more detailed, grotesque in their care, limbs frozen in strange gestures that suggested both reverence and fear. It felt deliberate, obsessive, as though someone had poured every waking hour into these objects, shaping them not just with hands but with intent. I moved slowly, careful not to disturb anything, letting my eyes trace the shapes, the carvings, the arrangement of objects in the candle circle. Each piece seemed to hum with a faint weight, a residue of attention that had been placed into it over long, quiet days. There were remnants of meals on small plates, now hardened and dust-covered, as though the hermit had eaten quickly and returned immediately to his work. Ash from previous fires dusted the floor and the edges of the hearth, and the scent of smoked wood lingered, mingling with the faint aroma of dried herbs. A journal lay open on a low table, its pages scribbled in careful, almost frantic handwriting. I moved toward it, drawn by a curiosity I could not resist. The words described daily routines, observations of the forest, and careful notes about materials and carvings. But as I read further, the tone shifted subtly, growing quieter, more insistent, almost as though the writer had begun to speak to something unseen. The hermit wrote of listening to the wind, of feeling shapes in the shadows, of believing that the cabin itself was a witness, a partner, and sometimes an opponent. The isolation was almost tangible in his words, a slow, pressing force that seemed to mold his thoughts and actions. I leaned over the journal, tracing a line of text with my finger. The writing described small rituals, movements repeated precisely at certain times of day or night. Candles had to be lit in a particular order. Carvings had to be placed facing specific directions. Herbs had to be dried and ground in specific ways. It was meticulous, obsessive, and I could almost feel the concentration that had gone into each act, the hours spent in solitude, in quiet communion with an unseen presence. Beyond the table, other objects caught my eye. A series of wooden masks leaned against a wall, some cracked, some intact, each with hollow eyes and distorted expressions. I imagined them watching, silent witnesses to the hermit's life, and felt the room close and slightly around me. Each object seemed to radiate intention, as though the hermit had imbued them not only with form but with a subtle, lingering awareness. I could almost sense him in the shadows, moving with measured care, hands shaping wood, arranging figures, whispering words that I could not hear but could feel. The circle of candles in the center of the room drew me closer. Their wax was soft and slightly warm to the touch, though the flames had long since died down. The figures within the circle seemed more alive than the others, their gestures almost deliberate, frozen in mid-motion but somehow expressive. I felt a subtle pull, a quiet insistence, as though the room itself wanted me to understand, to acknowledge the care and obsession that had created it. It was not threatening in a sudden, violent way, but patient, inescapable, a slow awareness pressing against me. I moved around the room, stepping carefully between shadows and objects, taking in the details. There were small notes pinned to the walls, written on scraps of paper and bark, some containing symbols I did not recognize, others short phrases that hinted at belief, caution, or perhaps warning. "Listen to the wind," one read. Another, "The forest remembers those who are patient." The handwriting shifted from precise to jagged across pages and notes, a subtle mirror of the hermit's own mind, ordered, then fraying at the edges under the weight of solitude. The faint smell of incense lingered near the hearth, the ashes of previous offerings scattered in small patterns I could not immediately decipher. I crouched to examine them, tracing a finger through the fine powder. The shapes were deliberate, almost ritualistic, and though I could not read their meaning, I understood the care that had gone into each one. It was an expression of life, isolation, and obsession, a tangible record of the hermit's presence, a memory etched into the physical space of the cabin. I paused near a window, gazing out at the dark forest beyond. The trees swayed faintly in the wind, their branches creaking softly, and I imagined the hermit walking among them, tracing paths, listening, observing. His isolation was more than physical. It had seeped into the wood and walls of the cabin, into the objects he had shaped with care. I felt the quiet tension of his life pressing against the air around me, patient, deliberate, unyielding. A faint draft stirred the papers on the table, and I leaned closer, examining a cluster of sketches. They depicted figures moving through the forest, shadows following shapes, gestures frozen mid-step. The style was precise, obsessive in its repetition, yet something about the scenes was off, slightly exaggerated, a distortion that made the forest itself seem alive, aware, almost sentient. I could feel the pull of the hermit's vision, his perception of the world around him, and it pressed gently against my own senses, a subtle reminder of the isolation that had consumed him. I wandered through the cabin slowly, letting my eyes linger on details, tracing the careful arrangements of objects, noting the interplay of shadows and light. Everything had purpose, everything had been placed with attention. Even the smallest, most mundane item, the edge of a knife, the curve of a bowl, the position of a chair, spoke to a life spent entirely in the service of observation, ritual, and obsessive care. It was a quiet, creeping realization, a slow understanding of the weight of solitary devotion. At one corner of the cabin, I noticed a series of wooden pegs holding strings of beads, bones, and small carved talismans. Each string was different, some delicate, some rough, but all carried the same sense of purpose, of careful creation. I reached out, hesitating, and felt the faint vibration of wood and bone under my fingers, a subtle echo of the energy that had been poured into them over years of solitude. It was not threatening, but insistent, a quiet record of the hermit's life and the attention he had lavished on the objects around him. I lingered by the hearth, watching the flickering candlelight cast long, thin shadows across the walls. The movement of light made the objects seem alive, the carvings shifting subtly in the soft glow. I felt a faint pressure at the edges of perception, like the hermit himself was present, guiding my gaze, inviting me to see what he had preserved. It was not fear that pressed against me, but awareness, a slow, patient weight of solitude and obsession made tangible, almost palpable in the room. Finally, I stepped back to the center of the cabin, taking a deep breath. The air was warm, but still carried that faint scent of smoke, herbs, and something indefinably sharp. The objects, the carvings, the notes, the circles of candles, they all spoke of a life devoted entirely to observation, to ritual, to careful attention. The hermit's presence lingered here, not as a ghost or spirit, but as a record, a slow insistence embedded in wood, wax, and paper. I understood then that isolation could shape more than mind or body. It could shape space itself, leaving traces that endured long after the person had vanished. I took one last, deliberate look around the room, noting the careful placement of every item, the interplay of shadows, and the faint hum that seemed to vibrate softly through the cabin. I felt the patient, obsessive care of a life lived entirely in observation and ritual, and I realized that the cabin, with all its objects and symbols, was more than shelter. It was a manifestation of solitude, a slow, creeping record of devotion and obsession. With that understanding, I stepped back toward the door, feeling the quiet presence of the cabin settle into my awareness. I had witnessed its quiet, obsessive world, seen the remnants of ritual, and felt the subtle insistence of isolation pressing gently against me. The path outside seemed both welcoming and strange, a bridge between the hermit's meticulous world and the forest beyond. I knew I would carry this sense of patient observation, the weight of ritual and solitude, with me long after I left. I opened the door, stepping onto the small, creaking porch, and looked once more at the cabin. Moonlight cast a pale glow on its weathered logs, and I could feel the quiet insistence of all I had seen pressing gently against the edges of my mind. The forest remained still, patient, aware, and I understood that the hermit's life, though solitary, had left a tangible mark on this place, a record of devotion, obsession, and presence that lingered quietly, inexorably, like the faint scent of smoke and herbs in the air. Night fell with an almost sudden weight, the moon dipping behind clouds and leaving the forest bathed in deep, muted darkness. Inside the cabin, the shadows stretched long across the walls, shifting with the faint glow of the candles I had left burning. Their flames flickered unevenly, as if in response to some subtle motion in the room, some rhythm that I could not see but felt pressing gently against the air. I stood frozen for a moment, listening. Outside, the wind had dropped, leaving the forest unnervingly still. It started as a whisper, faint and indistinct, so subtle I almost thought I had imagined it. Then it grew, a low, resonant murmur that seemed to drift through the trees, bending with the breeze. At first I could not understand the sound. It was neither language nor song, only a cadence, a soft vibration in the air. My heart began to beat faster, though I forced myself to remain calm. The forest around me felt different now, heavier, aware, almost holding its breath. I moved toward the door, lantern in hand, peering into the darkness beyond the cabin's threshold. The trees were silhouettes against the night, dense and unyielding, and from somewhere deep within the murmuring grew louder, more coherent. It was chanting. I could not make out the words, but the rhythm was unmistakable, the repetition precise and deliberate. The sound seemed to roll through the forest, coming closer and retreating, a tide of voices carried on an invisible current. I stepped outside, boots pressing softly on the damp earth of the porch. The moon broke free of a cloud, casting pale light across the clearing, and the shadows seemed to quiver, elongating and bending toward me. I tried to locate the source of the chants, scanning the tree line, but the forest offered only darkness and the occasional gleam of reflected moonlight on leaves. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere at once, surrounding me, pressing in with a quiet insistence that made my skin tingle. The air carried a faint smell of smoke, herbs, and something earthy like damp soil mixed with resin. I recognized it from inside the cabin, the scent lingering like a memory, a signature left behind by the hermit. It was both familiar and alien, comforting and unnerving at once. I realized with a sinking feeling that the forest had absorbed his presence, his rituals, and now they were extending outward, reaching for me with subtle insistence. I took a tentative step down the small incline from the porch, leaving the safety of the cabin behind. The chanting was clearer now, layered, almost conversational, like a dialogue between unseen voices hidden deep in the woods. I could feel the vibrations through the soles of my boots, faint yet tangible, as if the earth itself had joined in the rhythm. My breathing grew shallow, the sound of my own pulse loud in my ears, and yet I was drawn forward, compelled to understand, to witness what was happening. The shadows moved differently here, not with the wind but with intention, shifting at the edges of my vision. I turned slowly, trying to catch glimpses of shapes among the trees, but each time I blinked, the forms seemed to recede, avoiding clarity. It was as though the forest itself were a living canvas, shifting subtly with the chanting, responding to the presence I carried, testing my attention, my courage. I felt exposed, yet the forest held me in a strange, quiet embrace, neither welcoming nor hostile. The chanting rose and fell in a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. I found myself pausing, swaying slightly, caught in the cadence of unseen voices. It was a careful, deliberate sound, soft yet insistent, pressing against my thoughts in a way I could not ignore. I closed my eyes briefly, imagining the hermit somewhere in this darkness, his presence woven into the air, into the trees, into every object and shadow I could perceive. The realization sent a shiver through me. He had not just shaped the cabin, but the forest itself, infusing it with his isolation and ritual. I opened my eyes, scanning the undergrowth. Faint shapes shifted, branches snapping quietly under their weight, though I saw no one. The chanting pulsed in waves, rolling through the trees and over the damp earth. I felt a faint pressure at my temples, a tug on my awareness, like the hermit's presence was close, not corporeal but undeniable. My fingers brushed against the bark of a tree, and for a fleeting moment I could swear it shivered beneath my touch, alive and aware. Panic did not strike all at once. It crept in, slow and patient, wrapping around my thoughts like a cold vine. I knew then that I was no longer merely observing. I had become part of the forest, part of the rhythm the hermit had left behind. Each sound, each movement of shadow, each subtle vibration carried the weight of attention and intention. I felt my pulse quicken, not in fear alone, but in recognition of a force that was patient, deliberate, and quietly insistent. The chanting seemed to circle me now, threading through the trees, rising and falling in cadence, echoing off the trunks like the wind had learned a secret language. I could sense a pattern, a structure in the sound, but my mind could not fully grasp it. It was as if the forest itself were speaking, guided by some memory, some residue of the hermit's years of isolation and ritual. My skin prickled as I realized that leaving might not be enough. The presence lingered, following, observing, aware of every movement I made. I began to move backward, retracing my steps toward the safety of the cabin's porch, yet each footfall seemed to disturb the rhythm of the night. The chanting shifted subtly, rising and falling in response, as though testing me, warning me, reminding me that I was an intruder in a space long claimed and carefully tended. My breath came faster now, shallow and deliberate, but I forced myself to slow it, to stay aware, to notice rather than panic. The forest's pressure was subtle but unrelenting, patient in the way it encircled me. Near the edge of the clearing, a faint rustle caught my attention, drawing my gaze toward a dense stand of trees. Shadows moved just beyond the reach of moonlight, bending and twisting as though alive. I felt the presence there, patient, deliberate, and almost tactile, like a weight pressing against the space around me. I realized with a sinking certainty that the hermit's isolation had not been merely physical. His attention, his ritual, his insistence on presence had extended into the surrounding forest, leaving a lingering echo that could not easily be escaped. I turned sharply, heading back toward the cabin's porch, and the chanting followed, threading through the night air, patient and persistent. Each step I took seemed to resonate with it, adding to the rhythm, intertwining with the forest's quiet pulse. My mind raced, cataloging details, seeking patterns, attempting to understand the careful insistence that had drawn me here. I felt the cabin behind me, its structure and objects somehow magnifying the influence of the forest, anchoring the hermit's presence, and I knew that leaving this place would not erase what had been impressed upon me. I reached the porch, boots pressing onto the wood, and paused to catch my breath. The chanting seemed to hover at the edge of perception, the forest holding its attention just beyond, patient and watchful. I could feel the weight of eyes, or the impression of eyes, in the dark spaces between the trees, following me, measuring me, pressing subtly against my awareness. I realized then that the hermit's life, his rituals, his obsession with presence and observation, had left an imprint that extended far beyond the cabin walls. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me, and the faint vibration of the chanting seemed to retreat slightly, though not entirely. The cabin was silent now, heavy with memory and the lingering scent of smoke and herbs, yet the air still carried that subtle insistence, the residue of attention and ritual. I could feel it in the shadows, in the edges of the candlelight, in the very wood of the walls. The hermit was gone, yet not gone. His presence lingered, quiet, deliberate, insistent. I sank to the floor near the hearth, listening. The night outside had grown still again, yet I could not shake the awareness that the forest carried memory, ritual, and persistence. The chanting had been faint, almost imperceptible, yet it had marked me, touched me in ways subtle but undeniable. I understood then that some presences, some obsessions, are not bound to bodies, but live in patterns, in rhythms, in the quiet insistence of things left behind. Hours passed in quiet contemplation, the moon slowly rising and falling. I felt both drawn and repelled by the faint memory of the night's sounds, aware that the hermit's attention, his rhythm, remained in the forest, following, patient, insistent. Sleep was uneasy, filled with echoes of the chanting, the subtle shift of shadows, and the persistent feeling of being watched. Even as I closed my eyes, the awareness lingered, shaping the night and my perception of it. I knew I would leave at dawn, retracing my path along the lonely trail, yet I could not imagine the forest or the cabin releasing me entirely. The hermit's life, his rituals, and the quiet insistence of presence had left a mark far deeper than any physical footprint. It was a slow, creeping dread, patient and deliberate, a record of obsession and solitude that would follow me quietly, whispering in the corners of memory, in the rustle of leaves, in the patterns of shadows long after I had stepped into the light of day. And so I waited for the first faint light of morning, every sense attuned to the subtle persistence of the forest, the cabin, and the lingering, patient presence that had orchestrated the night. Even in silence, I could feel it, faint but undeniable, the weight of isolation, ritual, and observation pressing softly against every shadow, a reminder that some presences are patient, and some stories, like chants, echo far beyond the lives that create them. I first heard of the hill when I was passing through the village at the edge of the forest. The locals spoke of it in hushed tones, as though even mentioning its name might invite something unseen to listen. "Curse it," they said, though none could explain why, and most avoided it entirely. The hill rose like a slow, rolling shadow just beyond the edge of the old trail, its slopes covered in wild grass and dense thickets, as if nature itself had claimed it and wanted no company. For days afterward, I could not stop thinking about it. My dreams carried the hill into every corner of my mind. I would see a cabin perched atop it, crooked and half swallowed by the undergrowth, windows dark yet somehow alive, as if they were watching me even while I slept. Sometimes I would wake in the middle of the night with the faint scent of earth and old wood in the air, though my window was shut and the house silent. There was a pull to the place I could not explain, a quiet insistence, like a soft whisper at the edge of thought. I decided finally to see it for myself. The morning was overcast, the sky a uniform gray, and the wind whispered through the village as I passed the last of the cottages. The path that led to the hill was barely more than a worn trail, and I felt a small thrill as I stepped onto it. Every step upward made the world below seem more distant, as though I were leaving the ordinary behind and entering somewhere else, somewhere the village's wary tales only hinted at. The climb was slower than I expected. The grass was wet with dew, and my boots sank slightly into the soft earth. I passed twisted roots and broken branches, the forest around me alive with subtle noises, the creak of a distant tree, the faint scurrying of something small just beyond sight. The air grew cooler with every step, carrying the scent of damp soil and moss. I felt watched not by a person, but by the hill itself. It pressed against me in a quiet way, patient, deliberate, waiting to see if I belonged. About halfway up, I paused on a small outcropping, looking down at the village far below. The houses were tiny, their smoke curling into the gray sky. The path I had walked disappeared behind me, swallowed by grass and brambles, and I felt the first real shiver of unease. The hill seemed to shift subtly in my perception, like it was breathing beneath my feet. I shook my head and told myself it was only imagination. I had come this far, drawn by curiosity, and it was only natural to feel a little tension. As I continued, the vegetation grew wilder, the air heavier. I noticed how the trees thinned near the top, leaving a small clearing where the grass grew tall and tangled, brushing against my knees. And there, almost exactly as it had appeared in my dreams, was the cabin. Its wood was weathered gray, the roof sagging, a thin chimney crooked at one side. The windows were dark, almost black, but I felt a strange warmth from inside, like the faint echo of life long gone. I approached slowly, boots crunching softly on the earth, and the forest around me held its breath. The door was closed, hanging slightly askew on its hinges, and I noticed faint scratches along its surface, long and thin as if someone, or something, had tried to claw their way out. I reached for the knob, cold and unwelcoming under my fingers. The wood groaned softly, but it did not resist. I pushed it open and stepped inside, and the smell hit me first. Dust, decay, and something faintly sweet like rotting flowers. My eyes adjusted slowly, tracing the outlines of the room. A single chair by a fireplace, a small table covered in dust, and the faint outline of objects I could not identify in the corners. The floorboards creaked under my weight, though there was no one else present. Sunlight filtered weakly through the grime-streaked windows, casting pale rectangles onto the wooden floor. The air felt thick, pressing against my chest, and I realized I was holding my breath. I tried to settle, telling myself the cabin had been abandoned for years, that the villagers' stories were just stories. Yet something about the place resisted that rational thought. It seemed to watch, to measure my movements, as if the very wood and stone remembered those who had come before. I walked further inside, brushing my fingers over the dusty surfaces. A small shelf held a few objects, a cracked mug, a tin box rusted shut, and a thin, folded piece of paper that drew my attention immediately. I unfolded it carefully and found a sketch of the hill itself, the cabin drawn at its peak, surrounded by scribbled notations. Some words were readable: "Do not enter, they watch, they wait." Others were smudged or scratched out, as if the writer had second thoughts about leaving evidence at all. My heart thumped against my ribs. The hill's strange pull felt stronger now, as if the cabin had been waiting for me, and I had arrived just in time. The room was silent except for my breathing. I could almost hear the faint whisper of wind moving through the cracks in the walls, carrying with it an echo of voices from long ago. I imagined the people who might have lived here, a family, a hermit, or perhaps someone entirely alone, keeping secrets meant never to be discovered. And in that imagining, I felt the weight of history pressing against me, the choices, the fears, the small, quiet acts that had left a mark on the air itself. The cabin was not just a structure. It was a vessel, holding the memory of every moment that had passed within it. I moved toward the window and looked out over the hill. The grass swayed gently, brushing against the edges of the clearing. I thought I saw movement, fleeting and subtle, like shadows shifting at the corner of my vision. I blinked, and it was gone. Yet I could not shake the feeling that I was being observed from somewhere, just beyond sight. The hill had secrets, and it seemed to know I had come seeking them. My curiosity, which had drawn me here, now felt fragile, like glass underfoot, ready to shatter at the slightest misstep. I sat on the edge of the chair, letting the silence settle around me. The cabin breathed in quiet rhythm, a pulse that I could feel in the soles of my boots and the tips of my fingers. Outside, the wind stirred the branches, carrying leaves in slow arcs across the clearing. The air was thick with the promise of stories untold, of memories embedded in every surface, every shadow. I felt a creeping certainty that the hill itself was a threshold, a liminal space between the world of the living and something older, slower, and more deliberate. Hours seemed to pass, though I did not move. I traced my fingers along the sketch, reading the faintly written warnings over and over, as if they contained a secret I could decode if I only focused long enough. My dreams, the pull that had brought me here, and the silence of the hill all converged into a single, heavy awareness. I was not merely exploring. I was being observed, measured, and perhaps even invited. The cabin had been abandoned, yet its presence felt active, patient, waiting to see what I would do next. As twilight began to fade, I finally stood and stepped outside once more. The wind had died down, leaving an almost unnatural stillness. I looked back at the cabin and saw the shadows lengthening across the hill, bending toward me as though alive. My breath caught, but I did not step backward. I had come here seeking curiosity, perhaps even adventure, and now I understood that the hill would not release me so easily. Its story was entwined with my own presence, its past bleeding slowly into the now. With slow, deliberate steps, I began my descent, each movement measured, careful, as though the hill itself could sense hesitation. I did not look back until I was halfway down the slope. The cabin sat in silence, dark and patient, waiting for some future visitor, some next moment when curiosity would draw another soul to its quiet, insistent presence. And as I walked, I realized that the pull of the forgotten hill would not fade with distance. It had marked me already, and I carried its weight in the slow, deliberate rhythm of my thoughts, in the quiet of my dreams, and in the subtle sense that the world itself had shifted slightly, just for me. When I returned to the forgotten hill the next day, the morning air felt thicker, more insistent, as if the hill had been expecting me. The path seemed narrower, the grass taller, brushing against my legs with a faint resistance. Birds chirped in the distance, but the notes sounded hesitant, almost as though they were testing whether I belonged. My boots crunched softly on the dirt, yet the sound felt amplified in the quiet, empty landscape. The cabin waited at the top, silent, patient, its outline softened by the dim light and creeping mist. Stepping onto the small porch, I noticed the wood had shifted overnight, creaking under my weight in a manner that felt almost deliberate. The door, like a thin, tired breath, opened with a soft groan. Inside, the air was still and heavy, carrying the familiar scent of dust, old wood, and something sweetly decayed, like flowers long forgotten. Light from the overcast sky filtered through the grime-coated windows, casting uneven, gray rectangles across the floor. I paused, letting my eyes adjust, and tried to suppress the creeping sense that I was intruding in something deeply private. The interior was largely unchanged. Dust settled on every surface in thick, pale layers, and shadows clung to the corners of the room, shifting slightly as I moved. Yet something was different this time. My gaze fell on a series of mirrors lining one wall. There were 3 in total, old and ornate, with frames carved in twisting patterns that reminded me of roots or veins. Each mirror reflected the room, yet the reflection did not show me fully. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow misaligned. But then I saw them, faint, fleeting shapes behind the glass, figures standing where no one existed. The first mirror revealed a woman in an old dress, her hair long and dark, looking down at her hands as if she were folding something invisible. The edges of her form wavered, translucent, yet her eyes were sharp and focused, unblinking. She did not acknowledge me. I held my breath, careful not to blink, and the next moment she was gone, leaving only my reflection, pale and still, staring back at me. The second mirror was worse. A man, gaunt and hollow-eyed, leaned against the wall behind where I stood. His expression was neither angry nor frightened. It was something quieter, more patient, like he had been waiting a long time to be seen. His gaze seemed to follow me as I moved, though I knew he could not. The room behind him was empty, yet I could feel the weight of his presence pressing against the air, cold and deliberate. For a long moment, I could only stare, heart thumping quietly in my chest, until the faintest twitch of his lips disappeared, leaving only the empty reflection of the cabin once again. The third mirror was the most unsettling. It reflected nothing familiar at all. Instead, I saw glimpses of faces and postures, small fragments of people who had clearly been here before me. A child peering around the corner of the hallway, an older man sitting in the chair by the fireplace, a young woman kneeling by the threshold as if searching for something lost. They were brief, fleeting, each image dissolving into dust the moment I blinked, leaving me with the unnerving sense that I was watching lives that had been abruptly paused, captured by the mirrors as if time had chosen to forget them elsewhere. I moved cautiously through the room, drawn to the mirrors despite the growing knot of tension in my stomach. Each step stirred up faint clouds of dust that shimmered in the weak light, dancing over the floor like tiny specters. I placed my hand against the frame of the first mirror, feeling the cold smoothness of the glass, yet expecting to feel something else. Nothing came, except for a faint pulse that seemed to echo through my fingertips, subtle and unplaceable. My breath caught. I was certain I was not imagining the figures, yet logic struggled to assert itself in the presence of the mirrors, quiet testimony. I spoke aloud, softly, almost as a plea. "Who were you?" My voice sounded strange in the cabin, hollow and slightly reverberant. The mirrors offered no answer, only continued to show fragments of lives that had brushed against this place and never left. I walked along the line of mirrors, trying to trace the sequence of glimpses. Faces blurred and twisted at the edges, blending with one another, and I felt a subtle vertigo, as though the mirrors were tilting slightly, bending space in the faintest of ways. I paused before the middle mirror, the one that had shown the hollow-eyed man. Something compelled me to look deeper, and I found that if I focused, the air behind him shifted. It became a corridor, a narrow, dim hallway that did not exist in the room itself. I stepped back quickly, startled, and the image collapsed, leaving only the empty reflection of the cabin once more. I realized then that these mirrors were not just reflecting. They were holding, preserving, maybe even warning. Something had been captured here, perhaps unwillingly, and the cabin, with its quiet patience, had become a vessel for their stories. The air grew colder, almost imperceptibly, and I noticed the dust in the corners of the room stirred as though moved by a wind no one else could feel. I could sense, rather than see, the weight of absence. The people who had come before, their footsteps echoed faintly in my mind, their breaths brushing against the edges of my consciousness. I felt simultaneously veilleur and intruder, as if my mere presence activated some hidden memory within the walls. A small table in the corner drew my attention. On it lay a few objects that were not covered entirely in dust. A child's boot, worn and scuffed, a folded scrap of paper with faint handwriting, a tiny wooden toy. I picked up the scrap and read the words, trembling despite my best efforts to remain calm. "They do not leave, we wait. They look when no one is there, remember us." I dropped the paper, my hand shaking. The mirrors seemed to flicker in response, as though the room itself had noticed my reading. I forced myself to breathe, to slow my heartbeat, but the feeling of being watched intensified, subtle and unyielding. I moved back toward the mirrors, drawn once more, and for a fleeting instant I could swear the hollow-eyed man was smiling faintly, almost in recognition. Time became difficult to track. Minutes felt like hours, yet the sun continued its slow crawl across the sky, pale and indifferent. I tried to take mental notes, to record my observations with a semblance of rationality, but the constant flicker of faces, the half-seen figures, and the quiet insistence of the cabin made every thought slippery, fragile. The mirrors were not just glass. They were memories suspended, fragments of life unwilling to leave, lingering just beyond the reach of understanding. I began to notice small details in the cabin that I had overlooked before. The corners of the room, once dark but unremarkable, now seemed to hum with presence. Shadows moved subtly, brushing along the edges of perception. The air carried faint whispers, almost too soft to discern, as though the cabin was speaking in its own language. Each breath I took felt heavier, laden with unspoken histories and unresolved endings. I felt unmistakably that the hill and cabin were aware of me, weighing me, considering whether I belonged in the chain of witnesses their mirrors preserved. I sat on the edge of the chair by the fireplace, letting the silence envelop me. I tried to steady my mind, to distinguish between imagination and observation, but the line had blurred. The mirrors continued to shimmer with fragments of the past. The faces flickered in and out of existence, sometimes lingering just long enough to make me feel their presence. I realized with a growing chill that this cabin had been a point of convergence, a place where stories were neither ended nor released, and that by entering, I had become part of that continuum. Eventually, I stepped toward the door, needing air, needing distance from the persistent weight of the mirrors. The hallway outside the main room felt narrow, almost oppressive, the floorboards creaking faintly under my boots. As I passed the last mirror, I caught a final glimpse, myself, yes, but behind me, indistinct shapes moved, ghostly witnesses observing, patient, waiting. My stomach turned. The hill, the cabin, and these frozen visitors had woven me into a tapestry I had only begun to perceive. I stepped onto the porch and let the wind wash over me, cool and slightly damp. The forest beyond seemed quieter now, or perhaps I was simply hearing it differently, attuned to the subtle pull of the hill. The mirror's echoes followed me, quiet and persistent, reminding me that I was not alone. That I had, in some small and irreversible way, become part of the cabin's memory, another presence suspended in dust and glass, waiting to be recalled by the next visitor daring enough to climb the forgotten hill. Even now, long after I left, I can feel the pull whenever I think of those mirrors. The images return unexpectedly in dreams, fleeting glimpses of people who were there before me, or perhaps after, standing silently, watching, waiting for their story to be understood, or perhaps just witnessed. The hill is patient, the cabin is patient, and the mirrors, above all, are patient, holding every shadow, every whisper, and every fragment of life that dared to enter and never fully leave. I know I will return. I do not want to, not entirely. Yet a part of me, small but insistent, knows that the hill has marked me, and that the story is not over, not yet. The cabin waits, and in its waiting, the mirrors will continue to show, to remember, to whisper. And one day, perhaps, I will see more than fleeting fragments. One day, I may see the truth behind the glass. Night arrived slowly on the forgotten hill, like a tide rolling over the landscape in muted shades of gray and deepening black. The cabin's windows were dark now, reflecting only the shadowed sky, and the wind had begun to stir in the pines, sending a ripple through the forest that sounded almost like distant voices. I stepped onto the hill, careful not to disturb the thickening silence, and immediately felt that familiar pull. The way the air seemed heavier here, as if the hill itself remembered every footstep, every tremor of fear that had ever passed across its slopes. The pines whispered in low, rustling tones. At first I thought it was simply the wind brushing through the needles and branches. But as I paused and listened, the sound deepened, forming into faint syllables, barely perceptible, like murmured words just beyond comprehension. It felt as though the hill was speaking, not with a voice I could hear, but with a memory, a story embedded into the very air. I shivered, aware of how alone I was, yet somehow not alone at all. I moved slowly among the trees, the soil soft beneath my boots, carrying the scent of damp needles and decayed leaves. Each step seemed to echo in a subtle, uncanny way, the sound lingering longer than it should, as if the forest itself was taking note. The whispers in the pines grew clearer the further I ascended the hill. I could hear fragments, frightened laughter, sharp exclamations, even the muffled weeping of someone lost. I pressed my palms to my ears at one point, certain I must be imagining it. But when I lowered them, the voices persisted, faint yet insistent, threading through the branches in patterns that made my skin crawl. The hill had a rhythm, a pulse that I could feel through the soles of my feet. It was subtle at first, almost comforting, like a heartbeat buried beneath layers of earth and memory. But then it shifted, irregular, trembling with something older and darker. I realized with a jolt that the hill remembered more than I could imagine. Every story of those who had climbed it, every fear that had been left behind, had been etched into the soil, into the roots of the trees, into the wind that carried voices across the night. I came to a clearing just above the cabin. From here, I could see the old structure in its entirety, dark and silent, yet impossibly alive. Shadows clung to its walls in ways that defied logic. I stood there, letting the chill air settle over me, listening. The whispers were no longer random. I could hear repetition, patterns almost like chants, faint and low, weaving together fragments of sentences I couldn't fully understand. There was a cadence, deliberate, rhythmic, like the forest was keeping time with something unseen. I thought about the mirrors I had seen inside the cabin, the faces, the fragments of lives frozen in time. Perhaps this was connected. Perhaps the hill itself was a vessel, holding not only the cabin's memories but the echoes of all who had ever wandered these slopes. The thought made my chest tight. I felt the weight of history pressing down, the way the wind tangled around me, brushing my face and whispering stories I was never meant to hear. A sudden gust rattled the branches above, sending needles raining softly onto my shoulders. One, sharp and cold, fell against my cheek. I touched it, feeling the chill and wondering how many others had felt the same when the hill remembered them. The wind shifted again and I caught a faint, almost imperceptible scent, smoke, burning wood, and something floral, sweet and decayed. I could almost imagine the lives these scents had belonged to, lingering here, not fully gone. I began to walk again, circling the cabin from the outside. The forest seemed alive, watching, waiting. Every step I took disturbed the whispers just enough for them to respond. I thought I heard a name, my own, carried in the sighing wind, and I froze. The idea was absurd, impossible, yet I could not shake the feeling that the hill, the pines, and the cabin were aware of me now, and had acknowledged my presence with that quiet, patient murmur. I crouched near a small cluster of rocks, listening more closely. The whispers were clearer now, each syllable stretching and bending with the wind. I could hear fragments of voices like echoes of conversations long past. "Don't come back. We tried. It watches." They were faint, yet distinct enough to make the hair on my arm stand on end. It was as though the forest itself had absorbed the last moments of those who had been here, and now repeated them endlessly, like a memory caught in amber. I felt a presence behind me, subtle at first, just a nudge at the edge of perception, like someone breathing softly. I turned quickly, half expecting to see someone standing there, yet nothing moved but the pines, swaying gently in the night. My pulse quickened. Even alone, I could sense the attention, the watchful patience of a place that had seen far too much to be surprised by my intrusion. I took a step forward and the whispers intensified, layering over each other in a way that made comprehension impossible. Still, I understood the message. The hill remembered. It had not forgotten and it did not forgive. I moved toward the cabin again, drawn by the impossible combination of curiosity and dread. The structure seemed to breathe in the night, exhaling shadows that stretched into the clearing. I could hear the faintest creaking of the porch boards, though I knew I had not yet stepped inside. The air carried a chill that went deeper than the cold night. It pressed into my bones, into the center of me, making me aware of every heartbeat, every shallow breath. I reached the cabin door and paused. The whispers shifted suddenly, as if the hill had acknowledged my hesitation. A low, humming cadence rose among the pines, resonant and subtle, threading through the branches. It was almost musical, faint, and hypnotic. I pressed my hand to the weathered wood of the door, feeling the cold seep into my fingers. The wind carried a last, fleeting syllable, barely audible. "Remember." Inside, the cabin felt familiar yet different under the night sky. Shadows stretched longer, darker. The mirrors seemed dull, almost muted, but the memory of faces lingered behind my eyelids. I realized that it was not the objects themselves, the mirrors or the toys or the old letters that held power. It was the hill. The hill had seen everything. Every visitor, every life, every fear. The cabin was only a vessel, and I was only the latest witness. I moved toward one of the mirrors, the same one that had shown the hollow-eyed man. His gaze returned, faint and unblinking, yet tempered by the same weight I had felt outside. Behind him, the pines stretched, swaying and whispering, almost impossibly alive. I could sense every branch, every needle, vibrating with the memory of those who had come before. The mirrors reflected not just the room, but the hill itself, and through it, the voices of the lost. Time lost meaning. I could feel the night stretching endlessly, the whispers threading in and out of the wind, carrying fragments of stories I could not fully hold. I understood now that the hill was patient, infinitely patient. It remembered not out of malice, but because memory had become its form of existence. Each visitor, each whisper, each fear was catalogued, preserved, repeated, like a song whose end could never be reached. When I finally stepped outside again, the night air seemed thinner, quieter, though the wind still stirred the pines. I descended the hill slowly, trying to leave, yet the whispers followed me in subtle, teasing patterns. Every step seemed echoed by memory. Footsteps not my own, faint sighs, brief laughter, and words I could not fully comprehend. The hill had marked me now. It had added me to the collection. And I knew, in a way that made my chest ache with a mix of fear and fascination, that I would never truly leave. Long after I reached the bottom of the hill, I could still hear it, the wind in the pines, whispering names, fragments of voices, and half-remembered warnings. The forgotten hill did not sleep, and it did not forget. Every return visit, every silent step among the shadows, was another layer of story, another thread woven into the vast tapestry of memory the hill preserved. I understood, finally, that I was now part of it, and the pines, always whispering, would ensure that I never forgot. I stepped away from the forgotten hill slowly, the cabin shrinking behind me until it became just a dark shape among the trees. The wind had calmed slightly, but the pines still whispered as if reluctant to release me. My boots pressed into the soft earth, leaving shallow impressions that would soon fade. Yet I could not shake the feeling that every step forward was being mirrored, repeated by someone or something behind me. It started subtly. The faintest crunch of leaves, too soft to be my own footsteps, came from just beyond my shoulder. I paused and listened, heart steadying itself as I convinced myself it was the slope, the uneven ground, perhaps an animal. But the sound repeated, almost deliberately, matching my rhythm with eerie precision. My pulse quickened. I had read of haunted places before, stories of people who imagined voices and footsteps, but this felt different. Not imagination, not fear alone. Something followed me, close enough to exist just beyond perception. The sun had dipped fully below the horizon, leaving a deep, velvety twilight that painted the forest in gradients of gray and black. Shadows stretched longer, twisting around the trunks of trees like dark smoke. The air smelled faintly of pine and damp earth, but there was another note now, a metallic tang like rusted iron or old blood, subtle yet unmistakable. I drew a slow breath and tried to focus on leaving, on putting as much distance as I could between myself and the hill. As I walked, I began to hear more than footsteps. Faint murmurs came from between the trees, voices so soft I had to strain to catch them. Names perhaps whispered in patterns too deliberate to be random. My own name surfaced once as though someone called me softly from the shadows. I froze. The forest around me seemed to hold its breath, the wind stilling just enough for the murmurs to reach my ears. Was it memory, imagination, or some fragment of the hill refusing to let me go? I forced myself to continue, stepping carefully over exposed roots and jagged stones. The whispering grew, weaving around me, always faint, always elusive. I caught fragments. Don't forget. We are here. Return. Each word was stretched across the night, faint yet insistent. It was as if the hill itself was trying to leave me with its story, a final echo before I vanished into the darkness beyond its slopes. I glanced over my shoulder, trying to see if anyone or anything was behind me. The forest appeared empty, but the shadows seemed heavier now, pooling unnaturally between the trees. My mind played tricks, and yet the sensation persisted. I was not alone. A branch snapped somewhere, then another, always behind me. The cadence was irregular, but it followed the rhythm of my own steps, like the hill had lent life to something unseen, something that walked only when I walked. The memory of the cabin, its mirrors, the echoes in the pines, pressed against me now with a weight I could not shake. Each detail replayed in my mind, sharper and more vivid than before. The hollow eyes reflected in the glass, the faint laughter of a child long gone, the smell of smoke and decay. I felt them following me still, not in body, but in presence, lingering in the air, stitched into the night around me. I tried to reason it all away. Perhaps the hill had left something behind, a memory, a sound that clung to the night. Perhaps it was my mind, replaying the uncanny, the impossible, over and over. And yet there was no denying the pattern, the footsteps, the whispers, the feeling of being watched even as the cabin faded from view. Something remained, anchored not to a form, but to memory itself. At one point I stopped entirely, breathing slowly, trying to convince myself that silence would return. For a moment the forest seemed to obey. The wind softened, the pines swayed gently, and the footsteps receded. Relief washed over me, fleeting and fragile. Then came the faintest rustle, almost behind my ear, and a whisper so soft I almost thought it was part of my own thoughts. "Don't leave yet." I bolted forward, forcing my legs to move faster, yet the whispers followed, echoing in the gaps between my hurried breaths. I could sense their patience, their insistence. It was not threatening in a traditional sense, but deeply unsettling. The reminder that memory, once woven into a place as enduring as the forgotten hill, does not easily let go. I realized with a strange mix of fear and awe that I was now part of its record. Every step I had taken, every glance toward the mirrors, every shiver at the sound of distant chants, had been logged into something larger than myself. The forest began to thin as I approached the edge of the hill. Moonlight spilled across the ground, casting pale silver patches through the trees. Even in this light, the shadows clung to corners, shifting subtly when I was not looking directly at them. I could feel the whispers now, as if brushing against the back of my neck, tracing patterns along my spine, always reminding me of the hill, the cabin, and the voices it had collected over decades. I tried calling out, voice breaking in the cold air. "Is someone there?" My own words sounded hollow, swallowed by the vastness of the forest. No answer came, only the faint echo of my own voice, bending oddly in the night. Yet the footsteps persisted, just beyond comprehension. I could sense a rhythm now, a cadence that was not mine, but that aligned with mine in some impossible way. I reached the bottom of the hill, the forest opening onto a faint path leading away. Relief threatened to overtake me, but the presence remained. Every time I slowed my pace, the whispers intensified. Every time I glanced back, shadows seemed to deepen among the trees. I felt their weight, pressing against my mind, as if the hill had attached a part of itself to me, ensuring I would carry its echoes with me, long after I had left its slopes behind. By the time I stepped onto the road leading back toward civilization, the night felt endless. The wind carried hints of the hill, the smell of pine, the faint metallic note, the soft rustle of unseen footsteps. I could no longer tell whether it was memory or reality, whether I imagined the voices or whether they were real remnants of those who had vanished here before me. My heartbeat matched their rhythm, my breath carried their cadence, and I realized that leaving did not mean escaping. Later, when I tried to recount the night, I found words inadequate. Each description seemed to thin the experience, flattening the layers of sound, shadow, and sensation into mere story. Yet the echoes remained in me, lingering in quiet moments in the pauses between sleep and waking. The hill had given me something, a gift or a curse. I could not tell which, and I carried it, invisible yet undeniable, into my life beyond the forest. Sometimes in the middle of the night I think I hear them again. Footsteps along empty hallways, whispers brushing past the corners of my room, names called in tones both familiar and impossible. And I remember the hill, its patient, unyielding memory, and I understand that I have become a keeper of its stories, bound to echo them, if only in my own restless thoughts. I have tried to dismiss it all, to convince myself it was merely fatigue or imagination. But deep down, I know the truth. The forgotten hill does not release easily, and memory is a weight that persists beyond the edge of fear. Every night, every whisper, every echo reminds me. Some places, some stories, never truly let go. And I, willingly or not, carry a part of it with me. A reminder that departure is never absolute, and that some echoes follow us far beyond the places where they were born. I walk now with care, attuned to the quiet world around me, listening for patterns in the wind, waiting for the faintest echo of footsteps that may or may not belong to me alone. And sometimes, when the night is deepest, when the forest seems impossibly still, I hear a voice whisper clearly, carrying through the shadows like a soft promise or warning. Remember, never forget. Even as I write this, the memory of the hill vibrates in my mind. I can feel the pines in my chest, the whispers brushing against my consciousness, always present. I do not know if I am imagining or if the hill has truly left a part of itself in me. Perhaps it does not matter. Perhaps the point is not understanding, but carrying. The echoes of the forgotten hill follow me always, and I have come to accept that leaving does not mean escaping. They will be with me, quietly, patiently, indefinitely.